My father walked out on me 20 years ago. Tonight, I found out why. I hadn't seen my father in years. It had been 2 decades since I had set eyes on the man. My last clear memory of him was the one of him walking out the door when I was 5 years old. I had been watching cartoons. I turned just in time to see my dad's back as he walked out the door, wearing his standard blue jean jacket, with his head down as the door slammed behind him. My mother was on the floor, sitting cross-legged and crying a few feet away from me. The sight shocked me. My mom never cried. She was my rock, and I had never seen even as much as a tear from her. I crawled over to her and sat in her lap while she sobbed, completely at a loss of what to do. I remember I stroked her hair to comfort her, something she had done countless times for me when I was sick or upset. "Where's Dad going?" I asked innocently. My mom looked at her, her eyes red and puffy from the crying. "Your daddy is gone, sweetie. Your daddy left us," she mumbled. The divorce had to be done in absentia. No one knew where he had gone. I remember walking around town with my grandmother, putting up missing posters of my father. She could never accept that he had simply walked away from all of us. The posters stayed up for a few months before they all got torn down. Years passed. Mom remarried a great guy. I got therapy to deal with my dad leaving and eventually went off to college. Life was normal, though I never stopped thinking about my dad. Not really. Even when I thought I came to terms with it, I'd get the urge to Google his name or search for him on social media, but nothing ever turned up. That's why, when he finally did message me, it came as a complete surprise. I was at work, messing around on my phone, while I had reports to write when it popped up on my screen. "Is this David Lewis? From Topeka? And your mom's name is Penelope? If so, then this is your father. I have been trying to get in contact with you." I sat and stared at the message in disbelief. I set the phone down, then picked it up again and read the message. While I was processing everything, more messages appeared. "David, I'm so sorry for everything. For these years I stayed away. I really need you to answer me. I need you to agree to come meet with me." My first instinct wasn't to reply. I was half convinced this was some kind of scam. Someone knew about my past and they were going to ask for a Venmo or money transfer. I finally replied. "How do I know this is really my father, and not some kind of scam?" I waited for a reply. My heart was pounding, and a rush of thoughts were going through my head. If this was really my dad, I had a lot of things to say to him. Most of them weren't good. "I promise you, I'm your dad. When you were a kid, you had a ginger cat named Polka that died when you were 3. You had a stuffed teddy bear you slept with every night whose name was Mr. Simon. Please, David, this is really me, and I need you to agree to meet with me." I stared at my phone. I was racking my brain, trying to think of what to say. Tell him off? Tell him I'd gladly meet him because I'd missed him all these years? I did neither. "I need some time to process this. Let me write you back later this evening. I'm at work and I need to focus." Holding the phone, I waited for his reply. It came quickly. "I understand, but please, I need an answer by tonight." Going back to my desk to work on the reports was almost surreal. It was like I was a ghost in my own body. I did get everything done, though. It gave me something to focus on. Once I was home, I went straight to the bedroom and flopped on the bed, phone in hand. My fiancée wasn't home yet. Today was her late day at work. Of all the people I wanted to talk to the most, it was her. But she wouldn't be able to answer even if I did call. I read over the messages again. Honestly, I didn't have to reply at all. I could block him, let him sit around and wonder what he did wrong to make me abandon him. But I did finally message back. The curiosity was too much. "Why do you even want to meet with me? If there's anything you want to say to me, just type it out." His reply was almost immediate. "David, I'm so glad you wrote back. I was afraid I'd lost you. Trust me, I need to see you in person. If you never want to see or speak to me after that, I promise I'll never reach out to you again." I laid the phone down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. This was just too surreal to me. The front door opened, and Alicia walked in. "I'm home," she called out. She walked into the bedroom when she couldn't find me in the living room. She looked down at me and furrowed her brow. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" she asked, concerned. I shook my head and held up my phone. My dad just messaged me. He wants to meet me tonight to talk in person. I don't know if I should agree to go or not," I explained, holding out the phone to her so she could read what he wrote for herself. Her eyes went wide. Of all the things I could have told her, this didn't seem to be the one that she expected. She took the phone and read over the messages. "What do you want to do, babe? I know he's your dad, but he's essentially a stranger. You don't owe him anything. You still don't have to meet with him," Alicia assured me, holding my hand. "I think I want to meet him, even if it's just to find out why he left. I want to hear it from him," I said, squeezing her hand back. I turned back to the phone and typed out the message. "Where do you want to meet? Send me the address." His response: "Thank you so much, David. This means everything to me. I'm sending the address now." I was only mildly surprised when the address he sent me was only 30 minutes from our apartment. I looked it up on Google Maps and it showed a tiny cabin out in the woods. I felt a stab of anger from knowing he was this close to me and was only now reaching out to me. How long had he lived there? Years? Months? I would find out soon enough. Alicia insisted on coming with me, but I convinced her to stay at home. She had the address where I would be, and if she didn't hear from me in 2 hours, she would call me. And if she didn't hear from me, she'd call the cops. She wasn't convinced yet that this wasn't some elaborate scam. I had plenty of time to think on the drive out to my dad's place. When I arrived, I felt a pang of anger at the house. It was a lovely little log cabin. I knew enough about the area to know it wasn't cheap, and I wondered what he had been doing all this time to afford such a nice place. Not paying child support, that was for sure. The car had barely come to a halt before the door opened, and a man opened the door and awkwardly walked up to the driver window. "David!" the man said, breathless, a small smile on my face. It was my dad. Now that he was here in the flesh, it didn't feel real at all. He looked haggard and thinner than his photo had let on. I stepped out of the car and he backed away to let me out, the small smile still on his face. Everything I had planned to say to him vanished from my head as he gestured towards the house. "Come on, let's get you inside. I have a lot to explain before it's time." He started moving to the cabin, not looking back to see if I was following. I followed. I stared at the back of his head, glaring. He hadn't tried to hug me or touch me in any way, for which I was glad, but I was also disappointed that he hadn't tried. The inside was nice, minimally but tastefully decorated. It had a woman's touch, as Alicia would like to say. Maybe he had a girlfriend or even a wife. "Mom remarried. His name is Steve. He's a great guy," I blurted out. My dad turned and looked at me. The smile fell from his face and his eyes dropped. "I know. I saw that on social media. She looks happy," he said softly. I shrugged. I had said that to hurt him, but now all it did was make me feel a little guilty. "Why did you ask me to come here, after all this time? I just want you to know if you're going to ask about getting a kidney or money from me, you can forget it," I snapped, my voice sharper than I had intended. I wanted to play it cool, collected, but I was too frazzled. He stared at me. His eyes were watery as if he was fighting back tears. He seemed at a loss for words. I shifted awkwardly on the couch, averting my eyes. "I just needed to see you. I wanted to explain why I left. I'm not going to ask for forgiveness, but I do want you to understand why I did what I did," he said in a rush. I looked up at him. The obvious answer was that there had been another woman, or maybe some kind of debt to the mafia, anything really. But now that I was about to learn the reason, all I felt was a slow, simmering anger. No matter what excuse he gave me, it wouldn't be good enough. "I'm a werewolf," he said simply, spreading his arms in a gesture of resignation. I had to admit that all the things I had thought he might say, this was not one of them. "I see," I said slowly. He was mentally ill. Maybe he was schizophrenic or had some kind of mental break. "Look, if you brought me all the way out here so you could spin some kind of fairy tale about why you left, save it. I could tell you're doing well for yourself. There's no need to lie to me." I gestured angrily around the cabin. His eyes followed my hands as I pointed to our surroundings, and a tiny smile formed on his lips. "This isn't my house, David. The people who live here are on vacation, and I broke in. But we needed a quiet place to talk," he explained, stepping closer. I stood up and sidestepped away, moving closer to the door. "Are you serious? Do you have any idea how much trouble you'd be in if you're caught? You go to jail for stuff like that," I stammered. This wasn't going how I thought it would at all. I was wishing it was a scammer. It would have been less heartbreaking. He moved towards me. He lifted his shirt, And that's when I saw he had a gun holster on his belt with a small pistol housed in it. In a smooth motion, he lifted out the gun and held it out to me. I need you to do one thing for me. In all these years I've been away, I've done nothing but try to find a cure for this. To end it. To cure it. It doesn't matter. All I could find was this. The only thing that can truly stop me is silver. I have this thing loaded with silver bullets. It had to be done by someone who loves the afflicted. Otherwise, it won't work. Trust me, I've tried the alternatives. His eyes were dripping tears as he thrust the revolver into my hands. I stared at it, dumbfounded. Dad, this is insane! You're insane! You need to go to a hospital. I stared in shock at the gun. I'd never held one before. It must be done by someone who loves me. My parents are dead. I know your mom doesn't love me. It must be you. You're all I have. He gulped as he spoke. I held out the gun to him, but he stepped away and walked towards the door, blocking the exit. Look, we don't have much time. Once night falls, this will happen quickly, and you should know I don't have control over myself when the change comes. I've killed people, without even remembering it. You won't be any different, even if you were my son. He gulped again, the color draining from his face. I took a step back from him on reflex, clutching the gun to my chest protectively. I didn't want to give it up anymore. I didn't believe for a second that he was a werewolf, but giving him the gun seemed like a bad idea. It's time to go outside now. No reason to ruin this nice house. He huffed. His breath was coming faster, like he had just run a mile. His face, already pale, was taking on an alarmingly waxy texture that was making my stomach turn. I'd no idea if he was having a stroke, but he suddenly did not look good. He stumbled outside and I followed him, not knowing what to do. I glanced at my car. I could just run to it and leave. Take the gun with me and call an ambulance for him. Don't even think of trying to make it to the car. You won't have time anyway. He looked up as the last rays of daylight vanished over the horizon. It's happening. Forgive me, David. Please know I always loved you. I hope you still love me. He rasped as he doubled over, seemingly in pain. Dad! I gasped, taking a few steps towards him. No! He screeched at me, holding his hands out and backing away, before he fell to the ground and started convulsing. It happened instantaneously. In the movies I'd watched about werewolves, the transformation is always drawn out, painful and dramatic. But this wasn't it. His skin split open like it wasn't even his skin anymore. It parted like his flesh was made out of paper mache. My vision blurred as I took everything in. The beast rising from the sheds of skin and clothing and looking at me. Its eyes were a vicious amber, glowing and filled with pure malevolence. There was nothing human in them. We stared at each other for just a few seconds before it took a leap towards me, closing the distance between us in a split second. I shrieked and brought up my arm, the one with the gun. The creature was close enough for me to touch. I could smell the wet animal smell of its fur as it reached out towards me. I fired the gun on instinct. I fired twice. One bullet hitting the thing in its cheek and the second in the chest where the heart should be. The beast let out an almost dainty and human-sounding gasp as it collapsed sideways. It looked surprised as it hit the dirt. I dropped the gun, my fingers numb from shock, and I ran to my car. I started the car and peeled out of the driveway. The headlights briefly illuminated the thing's body as I drove away. It hadn't moved. The shock hit me as I was driving, and I struggled to keep myself on the road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing chasing me down. But there was only darkness behind me. I didn't call the cops, or an ambulance. I cried silently the whole way home. There was nothing I could tell anyone that would make any sense to anyone. Alicia had waited up for me, and when I burst in the front door, she gasped and asked me what had happened. I couldn't tell her the truth. I made up a lie on the spot, that I had met my dad and he was a drug addict asking for money. That the cabin wasn't even his, but a place he had broken into. I had to talk her out of calling the cops. There was no way I could ever explain why there was a dead lycanthrope in the driveway. She stayed up with me until exhaustion finally took her and she passed out on the couch. I stayed awake, though. There was no way I could sleep. I sat in the dark, sipping coffee and shaking. When the first rays of light peeked through the blinds, I let out a sigh of relief. The sunlight brought sanity with it, and I could start trying to convince myself that I had hallucinated this whole night. That's when my phone buzzed, and I reflexively looked at the message that popped up on my screen, and my heart dropped. It was just a single sentence. David, it didn't work. And that was My Father Walked Out on Me 20 Years Ago, Tonight, I found out why by the librarian chick. Classic name, very good. So, this story it's not bad. It's not bad. It's not great because this is another one of those cases where there's certain information where we're getting details, and then there's a lot of things we don't truly get details on. It's one of those where there's details in a direction we don't need. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So, like, I suppose the best way to put it is, you know, obviously, now that we know the father is a werewolf, a lycanthrope, whatever, and his transformation isn't like a typical lycan. It's more shapeshiftery, sort of less painful, but he also doesn't have control over the form, almost like a Jekyll and Hyde situation. It's so we don't know how he's got it. I mean, has he always been this way? Because you got to think about it. The fact that the father and the mother clearly had a baby together, obviously. Whether one kid or multiple, we only know the one, that's fine. But 5 years old is when the father walks out. Clearly, the mother must know. She must know something. Maybe she doesn't. I suppose it's fine if she doesn't. But it's just odd. It's just odd. So let's break it down further. So the thing about lycanthropes, werewolves, is obviously they on a full moon they transform. They don't have a choice. This is what happens. They only transform on a full moon. Which a full moon, I mean, it's not every day. You know, I think in some cases it's maybe once or twice a month, sort of a situation. Depends on obviously the light with the moon, everything. You know, it's got different phases and stuff like that. And it's just silly. It's just silly that he chooses to leave them all completely, yet he's still in the area. Clearly, he's still within the area, right? It reminds me of the other story about the guy who gets the one about the son is acting weirdly story. How the son and the mother are shapeshifters in a way, and the mother was trying to keep it hidden from the father the whole time, which was a good story, very sad, but here's a different form of that. So the dad knows he's a werewolf, obviously. I mean, he clearly has lived with this, and he's been able to live a life. We don't know how long he's been a lycanthrope. We don't know. None of that is apparent. But he's clearly done it long enough that he understands that once, let's say every 2 weeks, right? He has no choice, but for the period of night, he has zero control. Totally makes sense. Now, in other stories, when there are people not in control, they figure out ways, right? They figure out some way to kind of at least cope or deal with it. Some of them get super locked up, for example. Other ones, they have people protecting them and making sure they can't leave a certain area or whatever. And, I mean, sadly, other ones also just don't even go for it or try to find a cure or whatever. And as he was going, he's like, I've tried this, I've tried that. Okay, so he has at least tried. Fair enough. But then the fact of, like, silver bullets, but it has to be by loved ones, will kill him. That's just a weird extra rule. You know, because typically just silver bullets will kill a werewolf. I mean, yeah, you have to usually hit them with more than one. You know, you got to make sure they die. But it kind of, like, prevents them from regenerating. That's, like, part of the thing of the silver bullets. But it's similar with, like, vampires and stuff. Like, the silver is meant to be something that works against what they are. And, so I don't really have a big issue with, you know, oh my god, the silver bullets didn't work because maybe my son didn't love me. That's cool. I don't have an issue with that. I don't know. It just, there's something a bit strange about, like, about the fact that, you know, he could have found a way. He didn't have to leave this family. He could have just maybe talked to his wife. Maybe she didn't enjoy that either. I don't know. Maybe she did know. Maybe that's why they had a divorce. I don't know. It's iffy. It's iffy. It's very iffy that there's certain things that we just don't know, which sadly can't help us paint a good enough picture to explain why this has happened. I mean, there's also, like, a little bit of level of bizarre grammar choices here and there, and certain words that maybe either were duplicated or just the wrong words were put in place, but luckily nothing too much that took me out of the story and super frustrated me to have this be a bad story review. Yeah. I think it's pretty good though. I think it's pretty good. I mean, I wouldn't. It's not the best story, you know. It's just another sad situation, really. Nothing super horrific about it. It's more like just there are horror elements that are in this story, but it's more about the connection between a father and a son, and the trauma that's been brought to the family because of it. And I mean, the twist ending is kind of cool, but at the same time, it's not a super twisty thing. And then at the same time, it's like, oh my god, it didn't work. Oh, okay, well, we have another, like, I don't know, potentially 2 weeks for it to be a problem again. Because besides the full moon period, he's totally fine. He can live his life and stuff. And yeah, I also find it weird that he just, like, has no issue breaking into people's houses and stuff. You transform not all the time. Like, if you've transformed and you did it, okay, that's obviously, you can't choose that. But he knows what he's doing, and he's still happy to commit crimes like it's all fine. He's just, like, fully embracing the fact that he is not normal, and so he's, like, super doubling down on his actions. I don't know, that's just me. I think it's just bizarre choices, you know, bizarre choices. Also, the fact that, like, he just decided to randomly message his son after all these years, like 20 years, after 20 years, he decides to message his son through his phone, so somehow he had his phone number. Was he a tech fucking whiz? Is he calling up these, like, you know, Verizon companies and stuff and asking for the phone number of that kid? I'm not gonna fucking give you that information. What's it? He doesn't seem like a tech-savvy dude. I don't know. I'm nitpicking. I apologize. I really apologize. Besides my little niggles, the story ain't bad. It ain't bad. It's not every day that you see a werewolf in a story either. So actually, I'm pretty pleased about that. That was a nice, refreshing little monster take for us. I like learning about new ones, but ones that are new to me anyway. But it's nice to see a classic oldie one used again, because you tend to get a lot of ones about vampires and vampiric creatures. They're very popular. But yeah, werewolves don't always get the love. It's a shame. It's a real shame. Werewolves are cool too. Werewolves are monsters too. I'll get that on a shirt maybe. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. This has been Nate at Night. I've enjoyed myself, and I sure hope you have too. We will see you for whatever's next. Take care. I'm a cult leader, and I've made a terrible mistake. I just wanted a bit of extra money. I've always been a really charismatic guy. Not exactly unattractive, and I know how gullible some of those middle-aged, spiritually active women can be. I know I'm an asshole. But I needed the money. I didn't want followers. I wasn't going to make anyone drink poison Kool-Aid. I didn't want 100 wives. I was going through a rough patch financially and just wanted a bit of money. To my credit, it worked. It worked well. One of my exes had been real into crystals and astrology and meditation and all that, so I had a pretty good knowledge base to run with. I set up a website, called it Eternal Enlightenment, and paid for an ad service to promote it on various spiritual websites. My business plan was pretty straightforward. I wore a white shirt, white pants, sat cross-legged on some cushions on my apartment balcony at golden hour, and talked into a camera for 30 to 45 minutes about chakras and energy and the power of the divine feminine and how one could achieve enlightenment just like I had. Clips of these videos were available for free on my website, with the full versions and exclusive videos available for $99 a month. Only $800 if you paid for an entire year up front. Imagine how well that took off among my target demographic. Enlightenment? Access to secrets of the universe for less than $100 a month? The money came rolling in pretty quickly. I had nearly 40 members after the first 6 months, and triple that at the end of the first year. Things were going really well for a while. I even had some members promoted, telling them and everyone else that they were truly enlightened and would send them out to conferences and things to host talks and Q&As. I even took on a phony Sanskrit name, Sri Deepa, Holy Light, that I said was given to me by Buddhist monks during my training in India. I've never been to India. By the 20-month mark, I was making nearly $75,000 each month, and the lies had grown even more outlandish. I would bathe myself in light in my videos to make it look like I was glowing, use careful camera angles and more light tricks to make it look like I was hovering a few inches above the cushions I was sitting on. I had even had a place built out in the desert called Sri Deepa's Enlightenment Retreat that I moved to and would host seminars at. Things started to slow down at around 2 years, though. Instead of averaging 30 to 35 new members per month, I was barely getting 2. I knew I needed to avoid stagnation. I needed something big to get people's attention again. I settled on something one of the members of my inner circle called a transmission of enlightenment. I was skeptical at first, but she actually could read Sanskrit and had some book of supposed Buddhist or Hindu magic. To be honest, I thought it would be too outlandish to be believed. Even though I peddled all this esoteric nonsense, I hadn't fallen for it myself and knew, or thought, that nothing would come of the ritual. I explained this in a roundabout way to avoid exposing myself to this member, and she agreed to be the first person I would transmit enlightenment to. A few days later, everything had been set up at the retreat. It was in a small, private room away from the main pavilion where I would host my regular seminars, and it was attended by only a dozen or so members of the inner circle for a hefty price. I had one member operating a spotlight to shine on the volunteer when I touched her to really sell the illusion. Things went well at first. I gave some short speech of gratitude to everyone in attendance, how far they've come, and none of this would be possible without them, and how appreciative their friends and family would be if they were also convinced to sign up to be enlightened for only $99 a month. I was really trying to sell this ritual. I had swapped my normal white clothes for gold and red robes. There was incense burning on a small table between me and my volunteer. The lights were dimmed and a recording of some chanting was being played at a low volume. She stepped forward, and I butchered some Sanskrit incantation I had poorly memorized from her book. I raised my hands above my head and instructed everyone in the room to fill me with their energies as I reached out and made contact with my volunteer. The tip of my middle finger rested on her forehead for a fraction of a second before she fell to the floor, bathed in the spotlight that had been set up. There was a collective gasp as her body writhed and contorted before going stiff, her eyes rolling back into her head, her body slowly withering into a grayish husk of what it had been before. Thinking on my feet, I instructed a couple members to take her body away before quickly explaining that she must have had some impure intentions, and I quickly shocked myself away to my room. It's been 4 days since the ritual. The skin on my right hand, the hand I touched her with, has turned a sickly gray color and become dry and cracked. It's spread up my arm and I can't move it anymore. Streaks of gray are reaching towards my chest. I've had constant nightmares of horrific creatures ripping at my flesh, tearing me apart. At the time of the ritual, there were about 80 members at my retreat. My inner circle have tried keeping them at bay, but people have questions that I don't have answers to. I know I'm going to die soon, but I'm not sure what is going to kill me. The rot that's consuming my body, or the people I've conned who were banging at my door. And that was I'm a Cult Leader, and I've Made a Terrible Mistake by Elthal. Could be lethal. Both work. Pretty cool. So, this story is awesome because it's steeped in so many things that could very well be true, and it's exciting. It's so exciting because it reminds you that not everything you see out there is real. It reminds you of the fact that there are snake oil salesmen, there are con men. You've got people who they're just pulling the wool over people's eyes. You know, rose-tinted glasses, however you want to describe these things. And a fantastic example of it is any social media influencer these days. I mean, not all of them. Don't get me wrong, but there's definitely a lot of them who the whole point is they want to show you the best aspects of their life and how amazing their life is and all this, and you can have it too if you follow what they say and do what they say, and in most cases pay for something. You know, maybe a course or maybe some merchandise or this or that. You know, you're supporting them in some kind of way, myself included. Haha. I try not to be that guy, but you know, it's how people make a living, and sometimes you gotta calm them. You know, I think it's terrible. I don't like that kind of practice. Not really what I'm looking to do. But we're not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about the fact that I like the fact this story is great because you get a little bit of it from their perspective. But in this case, it's another one of those things that really reminds you about how lying can be, especially the idea that like one little lie isn't going to hurt you, but if you end up continuing and having more and more lies, eventually it will catch up to you. A fantastic moral for a story to have. And what I like about this is that it's yet again, it's one of those things where even though there is a supernatural kind of an element to it, whether you want to consider it as religious or otherwise, the fact is there is a true danger in this, you know, of some form of creatures or monsters or whatever even maybe ones that we can't see. Maybe it's stuff that, is perhaps there's something to this enlightenment or something. We don't know. We don't know how all of this works, But the fact is, they delved into something they shouldn't have, nor that they understand and respect, which is a big part of it. You have to, even if you don't fully understand how things work or why it works or whatever, it's usually good to at least respect certain ways, right? It's the same when it comes to like ghosts or demons, Ouija boards and things like that. You don't want to disrespect something even if you don't understand it, because you don't know what could happen. That's at least my belief when it comes to that. Because I don't personally really believe in ghosts and the supernatural and all that. I'd love to. I totally want to have an experience myself to really convince myself that, oh my god, yeah, this is real. But otherwise, I'm not saying it's not real. It's just I personally haven't had anything to convince me it's real. But I still approach it with a level of respect, because you don't know what could happen. And it could be very bad if you are disrespectful, Which is exactly kind of what happens here. The fact that he doesn't take it seriously. You are just going to read from a Sanskrit book. And the fact is, these people that he's conning believe it. They believe in all of it. And some of them, they obviously know quite a fair bit more about this sort of stuff than he does. But he's just doing it to play the game, to make some money, to con people, which is not good. But obviously he gets what's coming because of it. You got to still be respectful of things even if you don't fully understand them. Which he doesn't do, and we see what happens. He goes through a crazy ritual that he doesn't understand, probably messes up the incantation. I'm not saying that it's real, but, you never know. You never know. It's not something I would fuck with, personally. I really wouldn't. At least not in my house. Maybe somewhere else, because you want to be careful with that shit. You don't know what's going to happen. And so naturally, he somehow causes this person to writhe and convulse and start withering away, almost like they've been tainted or corrupted in some ways. Clearly the ritual's gone wrong. Nobody else knows that. He's not even fully aware that it could happen. He didn't take it seriously. And look what happened. Now he's also withering away and dying slowly, like some kind of a weird corruption is erupting on his body. But he's also now having these creepy visions of, like, monsters tearing him apart. But if you ask me, it's either the monsters or the people that will tear him apart. No matter what. It's great. It's such a good story. And it reminds you that you should take things carefully. Take things with a grain of salt, because you never know what's true and what's not, even when it comes to people. Honestly, it's great. It's such a good story, and I'm so glad that we got to cover it. I really, really am. It's a great little story, and I mean, cults are just fun anyway. Not like actual cults, but like, the concept of a cult in story form anyway. It's just fun. Because you never know what they're doing, you never know what they're worshipping, you never know what they're going to do because of it. Because not all cults do the same thing. They tend to have different ideals and methodologies. Even though a lot of them are similar, they can still do different stuff. You just never know. It's exciting. Rant over. I'm sorry. This has been Nate at Night. I've really enjoyed myself, and I sure hope you have too. Well, let me know what you want next. I'm really excited to hear from you guys. Talk in the comments below. I'm excited to see what you like the sound of. October's coming up. Oh, wait, no. Is it October now? Shit. When is this going out? I'm stupid. I'm recording this before October. I apologize. October's here. A great spooky month. I'm sure I'll try to do some things for it. There's definitely still some projects I'm working on, or some things I'm trying to be involved in, some sites I'm trying to check out. But as you can imagine, not everything is just immediate access. It takes time, it takes permissions, etc., etc. So I am trying. I do appreciate your patience with me. We will see you for whatever is next. Bye, peeps. I wanted to kind of give a little preface to the story because it's set in the Aokigahara forest in Japan, which for some of you may know the name. It's the infamous suicide forest, which is not how it started. It's just what it sadly developed as. It's originally known as the Sea of Trees. It's also potentially it's considered by some people that it has demons in it. Yurai is the specific word for it. Which is kind of how the story develops. It goes in that direction, really. But I figured we should still touch base with the whole suicide topic because it's a heavy It's a dark and it's a very sensitive thing for many, many people, and it's completely understandable so. So, we're not here to pay disrespects. We're here to cover a story set in a location which sadly has a lot of sensitive things about it. I mean, we'll touch base a bit about that at the end anyway. But yeah, if you or a loved one or even somebody else that you know maybe deals with these suicidal thoughts, you should definitely seek professional help. 100%. I'll probably pop some info in the description in case you're looking for any outlets. Enjoy the story. I'm begging you, stay out of Aokigahara. Em and I were always drawn to places with dark histories, the kind most people avoid. So when we planned our trip to Japan, visiting Aokigahara, the infamous suicide forest, was a must. We joked about it over coffee, scrolling through eerie photos and half believing the ghost stories that swirled around this place. It was all fun and games then. Now, I would give anything to undo that decision. We arrived at the forest's edge early, the morning mist still clinging to the ground. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into strange patterns, making everything feel distant and unreal. The forest seemed peaceful enough at first glance, almost inviting. Emma smirked as we passed a sign in both Japanese and English warning visitors against venturing off the trails. A grim reminder that many who enter never leave. They put these signs up to scare tourists, I bet, Emma said, her tone teasing, though I could sense a slight tremor beneath her words. Yeah, maybe, I replied, my gaze drifting to the darkened path ahead. I forced a smile, trying to match her bravado, but I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. Stick close, okay? She laughed. What? You're worried a ghost is gonna snatch me up? I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. Just don't wander off, Emma. This place is different. We moved deeper into the forest, following the winding trails. At first it was just us, our footsteps crunching over the old volcanic rock, the occasional bird chirping overhead. But then the air began to change. It felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest was breathing. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Emma seemed less chatty, her steps slower, more deliberate. We came across a series of faint red stains on the ground, leading down further the main path. Emma stopped, her eyes narrowing. Do you see that? Probably from an animal, I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. Looks fresh. What if it's hurt? Oh, what if someone is hurt? Her brow furrowed. Before I could stop her, she was already moving forward, her feet crunching leaves as she ventured down the trail, following another trail to the right. Emma, wait! I called, but she kept going, ignoring my warning. That's when I saw him. A man standing motionless among the trees, just beyond where Emma was headed. His head lolled to one side, his neck bent at an impossible angle, as if it had been snapped like a twig. His eyes were sunken, dark, his skin pallid, and stretched too tight over his bones. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed Emma's arm, yanking her back, but she barely noticed. Who is that? She whispered, as if afraid her voice might shatter him. I don't know. Let's just go, I urged, tugging her, but she wouldn't move. The man began to step forward, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, and that's when I saw her, a woman following behind him, crawling on all fours like a spider, her limbs twisted and broken in horrifying directions. Her face was a nightmare. Her lower jaw was missing, the back of her head caved in, but her eyes were wide, almost eager. Emma, run! I shouted, panic tightening my throat. We turned and sprinted back the way we came, but the forest seemed different now, the paths twisting, closing in on us. The woman's deformed body scrambled over rocks and roots with alarming speed, moving like a crab, her limbs clicking and snapping as she closed the distance between us. Her ragged breaths filled the air with a sick, wheezing sound. Faster, Emma! I screamed, my legs burning with effort. Emma stumbled, nearly falling, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her up. Go! Go! I yelled, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The woman was close now, her fingers, or what was left of them, scraping at the dirt, leaving a trail of blood in her wake. I could hear her laughing, a sound like broken glass grinding together. I risked a glance back and saw her face contorted in a grotesque grin, her eyes gleaming with some hideous glee. We burst into a small clearing, panting, and I dared to hope that maybe we'd lost her, that we might be safe. But the man with the broken neck appeared before us, blocking our path, his head twitching as if in silent laughter. Emma screamed as his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with impossible strength. "Let go!" I shrieked, grabbing a branch and swinging it wildly. He didn't even flinch. His grip tightened, dragging Emma towards him. The woman with the shattered limbs was upon us now, her jawless mouth opening wide, not unlike a python preparing for a meal. She lunged at Emma's legs, her fingers digging in with a sickening crunch. "Help me!" Emma cried, terror in her eyes, as I began to pull her away back into the dark. I reached for her, but something held me back. A hand, cold and clammy, wrapped around my ankle. I kicked, struggling, and broke free, watching in horror as Emma was dragged deeper into the forest, the two figures tearing at her clothes, pulling her by her hair, her terrified screams fading into the shadows. "No!" I shouted, racing after her, but I felt the ground give way, my feet slipping over loose dirt. I crashed to my knees, pain exploding through my body. The woman with the broken limbs began crawling toward me again, her body twisting and contorting in ways that defied reason. I scrambled back, my breath coming in frantic gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear them dragging Emma, hear her cries. And then... nothing. Only the sound of leaves rustling, the distant creak of branches. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in the back of an ambulance, shivering, covered in dirt and scratches. They kept asking me what happened, and where my sister was. But I couldn't form the words. All I could do was stare back at the trees. And then I saw her. Emma, standing at the edge of the forest, her body pale and gaunt. She was waving at me, a slow, lifeless motion. Her chest had a gaping hole where her heart should have been, her face blank. I lost consciousness before the ambulance doors closed, but I couldn't unsee it. Her hollow, dead eyes locked onto mine, forever calling me back into the darkness. So please, I beg of you, stay out of Aokigahara. And that was I'm Begging You, Stay Out of Aokigahara by NoGlass3279. Now, I think it's a great story, obviously barring the fact that it's talking about the suicide forest, which is a real place in Japan. It's a incredibly tragic thing, really. The fact the forest, I mean, you've got like it's just got a massive suicide rate for a forest. It's incredibly sad because that's not what it's supposed to be known for. It originally was it's a sea of trees. Is the actual like translation, because it's incredibly thick, dense woodland. It's a forest. It's awesome, and it's got like caves and everything in it. It's really, really cool. It's quite a place to apparently visit, despite its dark, story as well along with it. But it's also potentially tied in with with their folklore about demons, yurei, if you will. Really interesting. I could talk a little bit about that, but at the same time, we kind of also need to talk about other things as well. Obviously, suicide is a big dark factor in people's lives, and sadly, it's becoming it's hard. It's a hard thing for people to talk about, for people to experience. Of somebody else committing suicide is what I'm saying. Obviously, that I wouldn't know from the person doing it. It's hard to say. Obviously, I have no idea. But it's not something to take as a joke, to take lightly. If you or anybody else is dealing with any kind of suicidal tendencies or thoughts, that's not like a joke. That's not a funny thing. That's not okay. That's why there are trained professionals that you should be reaching out to, talking to, getting advice. I mean, you can obviously talk to other people as well, loved ones and people who care about you, of course. And I'm sure they will provide a level of help to the best that they can. But yet again, there's a reason that there are people trained in these sort of things, and they're the ones that we should really be trusting and relying on to assist in these sort of heavy kind of things. So absolutely, I'll pop a couple of at least one place down below in the description, maybe like a website or something in case you don't want to do a phone call. Completely understandable. We'll see if there's anything that you can reach out to in case you yourself or you know anybody else who might have those thoughts and tendencies, just to kind of help push them in a better direction, really. The whole point is support. It's not forcing, it's support. Sadly, after we moved on from that topic, because we have to, inevitably we're here to talk about the story. I just wanted to make sure we preface that important stuff. Damn it, I've clicked away. I'm just hurting myself now. I look like an absolute buffoon. Here we go. So besides the fact the forest is... so in this story, they're talking about there's like these demonic entities. It's quite clear based on the Spider-Woman appearance and the big man and things like that. They're clearly some kind of demons or demonic spirits, vengeful spirits, whatever. Even yokai, hard to say. But I know the stories based in the Aokigahara forest are talking about yurai specifically. So they are demons, really, instead of just spirits. And so it's quite clear that there's a playful element of that in this story, which I think is really good. I like the fact that we're pushing away from the other sides of the forest. We're talking about the actual more like folklore, mythological side, which is great. It's not a long story. It's not a bad story. It's got a lot of it's got a fair little bit of stuff going on. Good little bit of detail, which kind of really digs you in and gets you a little bit excited, and not excited in a fun way, but excited in like a, oh my god kind of a way. Yeah, I sadly don't have a massive amount to say about it, besides the fact of obviously the dark tendencies around this setting and things. It's it's pretty creepy, it's pretty freaky. It makes me think of things like the grunge, for example. Maybe Ringu, something like that, but I think the grunge is a little bit closer to it when it comes to, like, even though I don't think that's Japan. Is it Japan? I feel like an absolute doofus. I should have looked that up before I mentioned it. Because, it might be. Oh, God, I feel so stupid. We'll move on past my stupidity. But I'm going to leave it in because, fuck me. I'm happy to make a fool of myself. It's not a bad little story. I was if anything, I just thought a story in this kind of a setting, it'd be, for the very least, interesting to kind of look into it a little bit more and understand a bit more about the history of the place and stuff. And I thought that was quite interesting. It's if anything, it really reminds you like how dangerous the place is, how horrifying it can be if these demons are actually there. But then again, it also makes you wonder how many demons are there, right? Because I don't know much about the demon aspects, the yurai, if anything. I know yokai, they don't tend to do a whole lot with each other. They're kind of like more individual cases. But yurai, the fact there are two distinct ones here, maybe I need to look into yurai a little bit more. Maybe there are specific demons in that realm that I need to perhaps understand and learn a little bit more about. It's kind of like how in other paranormal sects and things, where we have definitions of specific kind of entities and stuff like that, and then even in the world of demonology, there are specific demons, and there's also like houses of demons. I think it goes pretty complex, obviously, besides the big one himself, which we're not going to say the name in case I curse this video or something. Would that happen? I don't really know, but I'm happy not to fuck around and find out. I don't want to put anybody else at risk, including myself. So it's been it's interesting to learn little bits about this kind of stuff, really, and to kind of share a little bit of that with you. So I've been Nate at Night. I've had an interesting time, if I'm honest with you, but I sure hope you've learned something too. I sure hope we come away from this feeling a little bit more educated about these kind of matters. And don't fuck around in forests. It's a pretty big piece of advice right there, especially at night. Really stupid idea. Never know what's out there. Wildlife, other people, spider women. You just don't fucking know. Be careful out there, kids. Take care. The previous owner of my house was deathly afraid of meat. The house was beautiful. It was like a dream. 2 stories, 2 bathrooms, 2 beds. The living room dropped down like in the 70s, and the kitchen was complete with an island and a beautiful view of the garden and a large towering apple tree. There was even some decor left by the previous residents. Little bird feeders, a stone Buddha by the front step, a tree of life tapestry hanging in the living room. The realtor had told my parents the previous resident wouldn't be needing these things back, but she would remove them before we moved in. But my parents told her not to. It made the space feel cozy and lived in. We moved in at the beginning of summer, so I didn't have to worry about school for a while. It was nice to have no additional stress, but it made me sad to have those months free without much opportunity to see my friends. I found myself worrying about what they were doing, if they were having more fun without me, if they'd already forgotten I existed. It didn't take long for me to realize moving was lonely. I spent my summer in the garden, pretending I was a forlorn maiden, cast away from everything she knows. I lay in the cool dirt beneath the apple tree, watching the leaves flutter in the warm breeze. Sometimes I would even eat an apple, but they were always a bit too bitter for my taste. I would wonder about the silver in the wood, like someone had hacked at it with an axe, and then gave up. Who would try and chop down such a beautiful thing? That apple tree became a sort of sanctuary. The shade protected me from the blazing sun on the hotter days, and the trunk became an incredibly comfortable backrest to lean back on and read. One day, while I was doing just that, something blew up against my leg. A dirty, stained piece of paper. I set my book down and picked it up, curious. I scanned it quickly. It looked like a letter, from what I could make out, but it cut off at the end, and there was no back side. I shifted from my spot against the tree, digging my fingers into the soft dirt and searching around. I thought that if this letter had been here, maybe, just maybe, the rest were too. I was desperate for excitement at that point, and I wasn't beyond getting my hands dirty to find some. Sure enough, soon my fingers were prying at dampened notebook paper, carefully edging it out of the soil. I think I found most of them just searching in the dirt. They weren't buried very deep. As soon as I finished reading those letters, I went to find my parents heaving. We left that house, and we never came back. I'll do my best to relay to you what the letters said, at least what I could read of it. Dear Sylvia, I miss you the worst in summer. The winter here is cold and unforgiving, but the summer is worse. I cannot even bring myself to leave the house anymore. I fear some days that death follows me, like a stray dog nipping at my heel. Now that you and Elsie are gone from my life, I have nothing left to run from. How could I be meant to stay here when you were not? Even so, I feel very strongly that dying now would be a betrayal to you, no matter how much I would love to join you wherever you are. My days are lonely and plain now. I eat nothing but what I can take from the garden. Thank you for my nourishment and my survival, my dear wife. There isn't much flavor to my food without the smell of you cooking it in the kitchen. I think often of my time as a butcher. I used to be happy with that kind of work, but now it only disgusts me. The thought of slicing through meat that was once a living creature, nearly brings me to tears. Some nights, when I close my eyes, all I could see is muscles twitching. It haunts me in your absence. I swear, Sylvia, I will never consume that stuff again. The apple tree is the only piece of you I have left. The only living piece. I could go catatonic for hours, just watching it sway. When I see that tree, I feel that you're nearby. I miss you. R. Dear Sylvia, yesterday I went to sit under our tree. It pains me that when you were alive, I didn't spend much time in our garden. Perhaps I had old hermit in my blood, even then. I preferred to watch you from the kitchen, admiring your gardening prowess from a distance. Perhaps that makes me a bad husband, but I think you liked that about me, how I always gave you enough space. It's nice out here, very peaceful. The fresh air feels like you touching me. I could have sworn I could hear Elsie's laughter in the breeze. I noticed something strange as I sat against the trunk, enjoying the sunshine on my skin. It felt like the tree moved against my back, almost as if it were squirming. Perhaps my mind is not what it used to be, but perhaps it was you. If it was you, thank you. I hope you'll reach out again. That night, I had a very hard time falling asleep. No matter what I did, I could not feel comfortable. My bed felt wrong, felt lumpy and strange, as if it were not made for me. I gave up and went to our kitchen, and I watched the tree through the window until my eyes grew heavy. It was so beautiful in the moonlight, glowing gently, drawing the eye. It was so quiet, so dignified. It made me feel uneasy, but in a comforting way, as odd as that may sound. When I got back to bed, it didn't feel wrong anymore, and I was finally able to rest. R. Dear Sylvia, these days, all I find myself doing is wandering the house, reminiscing. I don't dare move or change anything. I want to preserve everything just the way you left it. Our house is covered in little trinkets, hippie things that I don't entirely understand. You always had such an earthly style. Some of it I don't care for. It simply isn't my cup of tea. But I never would have told you that. I would never want to step on your toes. It's apple season again. I remember watching you and Elsie climb our tree, shrieking and laughing uproariously as you hung from the branches like monkeys. Elsie, my little monkey. I know she never cared for that nickname when I called her it, but it stuck. You were such a good mother, Sylvia. I hope you knew I knew that. I used to love apple season. I loved watching you pick them, dropping the ripe ones into wicker baskets in the grass, and a couple of days later the entire house would smell of pie, sweet cinnamon and sugar, and it would linger for days, even all the way up in the attic. This is something I miss dearly. Please, come back, Sylvia, and bake one last apple pie. R. Dear Sylvia, today I went out to pick apples. I thought maybe I could take a crack at your old apple pie recipe. Perhaps treat myself to something besides wilted vegetables. However, something very strange and disturbing happened to me. I was collecting the ones that looked the ripest. I am not the most well-versed in things like this, but I can make an educated guess. I found one that looked so perfect. It was red and shiny, not a scratch on it or a single wormhole, which felt lucky. I went to take a bite, and what I found caused me to vomit into the grass. Inside of the apple was meat. Raw meat. It was not quite the kind of meat I used to butcher, although it twitched as such. I could see white muscles and tendon. It oozed with pink plasma where my teeth had parted the skin. It tasted metallic and rotten on my tongue. The flavor still hasn't passed. I cut open every single apple I had picked. The trees seemed to shudder. They were all like that, made of meat. Some entirely, and some as if a rot was spreading over them. I can't help but wonder how long it has been this way. I feel unnerved. I feel that I can't trust my brain, my vision, or my taste buds. I feel I may vomit again. I do not know if what I experienced is real, but if it was, I do not know what to do. It is unholy what I have experienced. Tonight, I will pray. R. Dear Sylvia, today someone knocked on the door. I was still feeling shaken up and disoriented, so this caused my nerves to be completely shot. I do not enjoy interacting with strangers, or anyone for that matter. It was a man, and he was carrying a box. He asked me for you, and for Elsie. I told this man that you had not lived here for a while. He seemed confused, so I clarified that I was your husband and Elsie was my daughter, and you had both passed away in a tragic accident. That caused him to look even more confused. Forgive me, but I felt defensive and uncomfortable. I figured maybe this man looked so confused because I am old and you were younger. Oh, how I wish I could rid this planet of all judgment. This man seemed as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He left then. He did not give me the box, which I assumed was meant for you. Perhaps he was a co-worker of yours, or an old friend, or maybe even just a mailman. I feel sorry that he had to hear the news from me, even despite my disdain. I cried today. I didn't dare go back out to the tree, but I wanted to. I feel as if I may be losing my mind. That interaction with the man at the door made me feel unnerved. I wish he had not come. I only wish to be with you again. My bed feels strange and alien. It feels too soft, and I swear something smells rotten. Perhaps an animal has gotten trapped in the walls and died. I cannot sleep. R. Dear Sylvia, the smell of rot has become unbearable. I cannot live this way. When I sleep, what you could barely call sleep, I see you. I dream of that first day I saw you and my daughter, climbing that tree in your garden. How I watched from the street. I watched you climb and play and laugh, and you looked so happy, so holy. I saw that underneath this happiness was a lonely woman. I was drawn to you as if to a flame, the only warmth in a cold, barren life. I was drawn to you so quickly, and I knew you were all that was right, and I only wanted you, and I only wanted our daughter. It was you or nothing at all. You were the cold. And then these dreams twist and turn into nightmares, and I'm brought back to the day of your death. How you knew you would leave me before I did, and you looked at me with tears in your beautiful brown eyes. All I pray for is a chance to go back, although I know it isn't possible. I know if I could go back, something would be different. I could save you from yourself and Elsie too. You wouldn't have to die. The smell of rot has become unbearable. I'm too afraid to look out the window and see the tree. I'm too afraid to see it moving. Something is alive in that tree. I feel it in my bones. It is watching me. I fear it is not just the tree that is alive. R. Dear Sylvia, I have ripped apart our bed. Forgive me, I couldn't bear it. All I have found is more meat. It throbs and stinks. I've been sleeping on top of sopping, rotting flesh. I've destroyed our beautiful home. I've ripped apart the sofas and the carpet, and I've smashed the plates. And all I've found is flesh. Flesh and cracking bone. It is alive. It is all alive. And moving. It wishes to swallow me. I am being condemned. I'm sorry, Sylvia. I'm sorry Elsie found me in the attic that day. I'm sorry you were so afraid. If only you had known I only had good in my heart and love for you. If only I could sleep above you and listen to you snore once more. If only I could watch you one more time out of your kitchen window in the summer. You with our daughter, so oblivious, glowing with ignorant joy. I could have made you happy in that way, and more. I loved you, Sylvia, and you loved me. I remember how we fought. A few days after I told you couldn't leave until we worked everything out. How you called me sick. If I'm the one who is sick, why am I the one still breathing? It is all made of meat. It sickens me. Makes me want to scream and vomit and bash my head into the wall. It is all wrong. It is all rot. I can't help but feel that you're doing this to me on purpose. Do you want me to join you so badly that you would haunt my every waking hour? I hear sirens now. The blue and red lights flash against the throbbing crimson walls. They twitch with glee at my suffering, at my terror. I will go to the garden with my axe, the last thing you saw with mortal eyes. I will chop down our tree, and I know what I will find inside. I will find meat. I will bury these letters for you in the dirt above your head, and I will chop it down so that you cannot haunt me any longer. And if they try and stop me, I will take them with me. They will not take my wife and my daughter from me again, nor me away from them. That was the trouble in the first place. I will see you soon, my dear. R. And that was The Previous Owner of My House Was Deathly Afraid of Meat by Orange PLR. This story, holy cow. This story is so good. It is so well done. Because you go into it, just by the title alone, you go into it having, usually how people are whenever you read a title of anything. You have like a, I wouldn't say an expectation, but you have this like idea in your mind, what you think is going to be, what you think it's going to be like, what you think is going to happen, it's usually how it goes. This title, it doesn't say a lot. It gives you a little idea, and you're thinking like, okay, so somebody's moving into a house, and they're finding out that whoever lived there before, deathly afraid of meat. Well, what kind of meat? Like, why deathly afraid? Clearly something traumatic happened involving meat that they would become this way, right? That's kind of all we had to go on. And so it starts off with, a family moves in, like we said, setting up a background, setting up what's going on, which is good, but I love the fact that it was also not super relevant. You're not sure. You're not aware that it's going to be relevant or not. But the fact that their little chapter is so small of them moving in, feeling this and feeling that, and then the kid goes out to the tree and surprisingly finds some notepaper pieces in in the dirt by the tree. And it's like, oh my god. And so they read them, disgusted, show the parents, they get the fuck out of there kind of stuff. It's like, oh my god, but what's on these papers? You know, why would this be so horrific that they would instantly leave and, you know, try to move out and shit? Like, whoa, you just got here. And then when you start like uncovering the story of R and Sylvia, well, it's crazy because at first you're led to believe that R and Sylvia are married and that they were married, and that they have a daughter Elsie, and that they lived at the house and everything was good and blah 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 blah. He's a butcher. She's I don't remember what she was. I think just a lovely lady. And you know she would take care of the place and take care of the daughter, and they'd have fun and everything. And then it slowly unravels further and further on. You discover that, you know, Sylvia doesn't even know who he is. They aren't married. He's broken into their house and he's been living in their attic. He's been spying, stalking, you know, Sylvia and her daughter, pretending that that's his fantasy life. And then the fact that, like, Elsie one day goes in the attic and finds him, freaks out, obviously goes and tells her mother, and our butcher, horrible man R, comes out with an axe and kills them both by the tree. Holy shit. But then it also makes you wonder, because he clearly wasn't there much longer after they died. Inevitably the police come. Not the same day, but I'd say maybe a week later. Like it's not very clear the difference of time between the death and the police arrival. We're just aware, based on the context clues, that is what's happened. And the fact that, like, so many things are turning into meat. You know, like things are being stuffed with meat. The house is alive. I think it's definitely some kind of a madness thing playing on him. But at the same time, what if it's not? What if maybe Sylvia's haunting him in some kind of a way? Perhaps that's a possibility. You also have to wonder if madness is something at play here. I mean, he's definitely going mad. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But then again, he was mad to begin with. The fact that he would do all these horrific things anyway. But this is not like a typical madness. This is like a beyond hallucination kind of a madness. Almost like a Lovecraftian kind of a way, if you know what I'm talking about. How things become more real the more mad you become. Sort of a situation. This story, you uncover more and more. It's one of those excellent things where you uncover little bits and pieces as you go along, and it's enough to keep you going. It's enough to keep you interested. And then when the puzzle pieces start fitting together, and when the story truly unravels, it just like blows you away, and you're like, holy shit. When all the realization comes together, it's like, wow. It's like, wow. It's crazy. It's absolutely, it's phenomenal. This is an excellent story. I was so blown away reading the final paragraphs and everything. When it all made sense in my head, I was like, holy shit. Wow. Wow. And then another reason why they were horrified about finding the letters and everything is the fact that in the final letter it says that he buried him, you know, by the tree, and put the note, the papers, like above her head. It's like, holy shit. It's oh my god, it's so good. It is so. Oh, it's so good. I'm sorry. I had to jump into this as soon as I could. I really, really did. Because this is just like, wow. What excellent storytelling. This was such a joy to read. Such a joy to read. I'm so glad I get to share it with all of you. Honestly. What a story. What a story. Right, I'll stop rambling, because as much as I like doing that kind of stuff, you know, we're not here to ramble forever. I have been Nate at Night, and I have had a fantastic time, and I sure hope you have too. We will see you for whatever's next. Take care. My wife suffered a head injury. Now she has 4 pupils instead of 2. Hospitals, to me, feel like an extension of the afterlife. This is surely not an original thought. The long hallways lined with shuddering fluorescent lights and medical carts, the somber staff and weeping families. It becomes a sort of limbo after a while. Not life and not death. Even when you finally leave, your clothes still reek of suffering. Sitting in the waiting room, I felt like there was nothing outside of these walls. Nothing but an eternal black void. My phone buzzed loudly against an uncomfortable plastic chair, and I raised my hand to the receptionist, as if to apologize. I sent the caller to voicemail without even checking the contact. "Mr. Sharp." The doctor's voice cut through the suffocating quiet of the wide hall, and I sat up, adjusting my shirt that had bunched up around my waist from slouching. "Oh, that's me." He was pushing a wheelchair, and I smiled when I saw my wife, sitting upright and smiling back, tired but overall normal. I stood, giving her a quick hug and a kiss on top of her head. "Mr. Sharp, your wife is doing just fine," the doctor told me, looking between us. I sighed. Thank God. I was sure it would be much worse. "Well," the doctor glanced around us at the nearly empty waiting room, as if he didn't want to be overheard. "There's something I'd like to speak with you about." I frowned. "Yes?" "It's her eyes." I took a step back and got a better look at Dahlia. She was wearing her clothes from home, the ones I'd brought her, considering the ones she'd come in had been drenched in blood and green paint, and other than a bandage around her head, she looked normal. "Take a closer look," the doctor said, as if he had read my mind. I leaned in closer, examining my wife's face. I gazed into her blue eyes, and my heart sank. Instead of only one pupil in each, there were two. They looked strange and almost wispy, and they appeared to bulge against the edge of her irises like they were stretching them out. I gasped. I didn't know how I hadn't noticed before. They made her look alien. "We need to do more tests," the doctor muttered as I stared, mystified, into Dahlia's eyes. "It must have been the blunt trauma from her fall that caused this. Normally we would label this condition polychoria. However, normally?" I interrupted, my tone brisk. I felt a little unsteady on my feet. "However," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "that condition is very rare, and I haven't seen it caused by trauma before. Usually one would be born with something like this, rather than it developing. We need to make several follow-up appointments, but her vision seems fine, and besides that, she only needs to rest and get back to her life." "Are you serious?" I looked around at the patients and their families who were now staring. I lowered my voice into a hiss. "She looks like a monster. She can't just be okay." Dahlia took my hand. I took a deep breath, trying to self-regulate. "For her sake."
"Honey,"
she said softly, pressing my hand against her cheek.
"I'm fine. I promise. I feel fine. And the doctors are very nice. They're going to figure it out. Look at me."
I looked at her again, trying not to panic at her otherworldly appearance.
"I'm fine,"
she said again, giving me a gentle smile. I straightened up, getting a hold of myself. I chose to believe her. I'm sorry. I mumbled in the doctor's direction. I'm sorry. I'm just tense. This has all been a lot." "I completely understand. Both of you need some rest, I would say." He couldn't have been more right. My own eyes didn't feel normal, like there were strings holding them open. I felt like I had been in this hospital for years, even though it had only been a few days. I couldn't imagine how my wife felt. I helped her to the car. The doctors wouldn't let her walk, not until she was off of their property, even though she insisted she was able to. On the drive home, we were quiet, but I took her hand, squeezing it occasionally. We were both a little in shock, I think. When we got home, we both stopped in the living room. I hadn't been home long enough to clean, and the sight of the toppled ladder laying beside the pool of dried blood must have been a lot to process. She stared for a long moment, blinking her new eyes.
"Is this the color we chose?"
she asked finally. She bent over, picking up the dried-up paint roller off the floor and taking a closer look. I stared at her, incredulous. I couldn't believe that, over everything else, was what she was thinking about right now. "Yes, honey," I told her, wrapping my arm around her waist hesitantly, as if she might shatter like glass. "October mist. Remember?"
"Huh,"
she mumbled, shaking her head.
"All right."
I guided her to our bed, and she pulled the heavy duvet over herself, letting out a breath like she'd been holding it for days.
"Sorry about all this,"
she whispered after a while, clearly only half awake. I chuckled. "Don't be sorry, my love. I'm sorry." She didn't respond, falling asleep as quickly as she had fallen off of that ladder. When my wife finally woke up again, late into the afternoon the next day, I was long past done cleaning up the living room, and I was waiting with the kettle running and her bottle of pain medication. I poured her a mug of Earl Grey, and I stared at her as she blew on it, taking her usual seat at the kitchen table. Her eyes were no less jarring than they had been the day before. I felt like I couldn't look at her. Like every time those second pupils fixed on me, something squirmed in my stomach. Something deeply wrong. How are you feeling? I asked, when she finally looked up at me, not wanting to make her feel insecure about her condition.
I feel good.
She told me, and she smiled. Somehow, she looked even happier now than she had before the accident. I bit my tongue, just barely able to stop myself from blurting out, why? Really?
Yes.
She sipped her tea.
I mean, my head hurts a little, but I feel good. I feel like I've woken up from a long dream.
Her words made me feel uneasy. I laughed nervously. Well, you were asleep for a while. She laughed too, and shook her head.
Not that kind of dream, Ben.
Dahlia almost seemed giddy. Now that she wasn't tired anymore, she was more lively than ever, and she kept looking around as if she were a child seeing the world for the first time. I only realized why when we stepped outside for our usual late afternoon walk. I'd wanted her to rest longer, but she insisted that she wanted to. Dahlia gasped, and her hands flew to her mouth.
It's beautiful.
I followed her gaze to the orange and pink sunset, just beginning to creep up above the trees and houses of our neighborhood. It was pretty, sure, but nothing we hadn't seen before. Her pupils, all four of them, widened, swelling into each other. I winced.
I know this sounds strange, but everything seems brighter.
She told me, practically skipping down our front steps.
All the colors are more vivid. I feel like my vision is even better than before. This must be incredibly rare, don't you think?
I bit the inside of my cheek, trailing after her warily. That's great, honey. I'm so glad it's not worse. You really could have lost your vision. She didn't seem like she was even listening. She led me like a stray dog down the street, pointing things out to me that I would have never noticed before. How the neighbor's doorknob was a vastly clashing shade of yellow to their red door, the oil slick shimmering on the feathers of the crows, all the spots where graffiti had been painted over again and again that seemed impossible to spot with the naked eye. It gave me such a strange, sick feeling. I couldn't name it, but my wife was so happy. So who was I to bring her down? I truly felt that way until a few days later. My wife shifted and yawned as she woke up, rolling to face me, and I could barely keep myself from screaming. Dahlia had 3 pupils in each eye now. Like 3 black holes, shrunken from the light streaming through our bedroom windows. Her irises looked pinker than before, as if they were cracking from the pressure of holding them in, keeping them from spilling into the whites of her eyes. It was unnatural. I sped to the hospital, my wife protesting the entire way. I ignored her. This wasn't right. It wasn't normal, and something had to be done. I stayed with her as they checked her vitals and shone lights in her eyes. I had to look away as her pupils widened and contracted, just like regular eyes. It made me feel nauseous, or like I might faint. They tested her vision again. I watched the doctor's face carefully as she finished each trial, but he was surely being cautious not to give anything away. He just nodded and moved on each time. Finally, he sat back in his seat, scratching at his head with the capped end of a pen. I don't know what to tell you, he said, shaking his head. Mrs. Sharp, your vision is amazing. You have 20/10 vision in both of your eyes. How is that possible? I looked between both of them, shocked. The doctor looked confused, but my wife only looked ecstatic. She only had 20/40 last time she checked. She needed reading glasses. The doctor shrugged, checking his records. Like I said, I don't know what to tell you. I think all we can do is give it some time and keep watching it closely. Come back in if anything changes. He sent us away. I couldn't believe it. There was no way this was happening. On top of it all, my wife didn't seem alarmed in the slightest. She looked from wall to wall like she was taking everything in, like she was absorbing it.
This waiting room is very dirty,
she whispered to me absent-mindedly as I pushed open the front door for her. By the time we got home, however, she felt a bit differently. She slumped into my side, her eyelids drooping.
I feel very overwhelmed.
She told me.
I think I need to rest my eyes for a bit.
I felt a bit relieved. Finally, she would show the symptoms of what she had been through. Finally, everything would feel a little bit normal. But again, that didn't last very long. She woke up energized in the morning, and she asked me to take her on a drive. I resisted at first, but she pleaded with me, and eventually I gave in. While we drove, she described things that I couldn't see. She told me there were colors that she hadn't even known existed. Colors she would never be able to explain. Greenish, bluish, purplish, orangish things. Colors that didn't make any sense. She said she could see the UV in the air, flickering and swimming across her vision like strange alien moths. She told me she felt like she could see the worms moving beneath the ground, and the birds flying far above the clouds. She seemed almost manic with glee over this. I felt extremely uncomfortable, but I listened to her ranting nonetheless. When we got back home, she said the car door handle was coated in germs, so I opened it for her. The next day, Dahlia woke up with 5 pupils in each eye. The skin around them was red and swollen, as if she'd been crying or violently rubbing at them. She wailed at me to get away from her, to get out. I nearly tripped backing out of our bedroom, my eyes welling up with tears. I sprinted downstairs and I called an ambulance. As they wheeled her into the ambulance on a stretcher, her arms and legs strapped down to minimize her thrashing, I got another good look at her face. She glared at me with blazing hatred, and her eyes reminded me of the eyes of a fly. They made me feel itchy, somewhere beneath my skin. That was not my wife. My beautiful, sweet wife. That was something else. Someone else. Someone I didn't know. They kept her for a while. When I got to the hospital, they told me they would keep me updated, but it would be best if I went back home and waited for news. I got many calls those next few days, all of which I sent to voicemail, because they weren't from the hospital. I cried and paced and tried to distract myself, none of which helped. I cursed the broken ladder in our garage for not working properly. I prayed. Finally, I got the call. I could come and see her. I packed an overnight bag and I made my way there, running through multiple red lights in the process. They had taken Dahlia to a mental wing of the hospital this time. Somehow, this section felt even more like strange limbo. Despite my rush to get here, I found myself walking slower down these halls, feeling afraid to make any loud noises and disrupt the stiff silence. The nurse who had taken me to her squeezed my shoulder when we arrived, and she left me alone with her. I stood in the doorway, just looking at her for a long time. My wife was sitting up in her hospital bed, looking back at me. Her hair looked mousy and unwashed. Her face was red and rashy. It looked like she'd been scratching at it. Her wrists were red too, from her restraints that were no longer holding her. She was calm. At first I thought her eyes were completely black. With closer inspection, though, I found that that wasn't the case. I couldn't count how many pupils she had. I could only guess maybe somewhere in the 20s. They all fought against each other, moving together, swelling in her skull like some kind of breathing hive. Some were broken or wispy, like they hadn't fully developed, or glossy and merged into each other like an embryo. Her eyes were no longer blue.
Hi, Benjamin.
She spoke finally, her voice raspy from screaming. I frowned. She never called me Benjamin. Only Ben. When we had met, she told me she didn't like it, that it felt too formal, like we were strangers. Hi, honey, I said softly, carefully. I went to approach her bed, but she held out a hand, stopping me in my tracks. How are you feeling? That was when she smiled. It was not her normal smile. Her smile was twisted, unfurling up her cheeks like cracked leather. It looked painful and strained. It looked unnatural.
I feel beautiful, Benjamin. I can see everything.
I swallowed. What do you mean you can see everything, my love? I found myself talking to her as if she was a child, like I was humoring her. It might have offended at the time. I thought she might have completely lost it. She shifted in her bed, but her smile didn't falter for a second.
Everything, honey.
She repeated slowly, and her voice made me shiver. The air in the room felt hot and stuffy, like any airflow that had existed before had gone for decades.
I can see everything, and I know everything.
She raised a hand, pointing a finger at me.
I can see through your skin, my love, and into your bones, and I can see your heart pumping your filthy blood through your filthy veins. I can see through everything that you are and ever have been. I can see you from your mother's womb to your unmarked gravestone. I can see into the fabric of your universe, honey.
She spoke the pet names like she was mocking me, belittling me. I just stared at her, shocked into silence for a moment. "You're just sick," I told her, my brow furrowing. "You're going to get better, Dahlia. You just need rest."
No!
She shouted, the words sharp and cutting.
No, you are the one who is sick. You will see what happens to sick men like you.
What do you mean? My voice was shaky, and now I felt cold. I cleared my throat. Her smile only seemed to widen, and what she said next made me feel lightheaded.
Do you think I don't know? Do you think I can't see you taking those screws out of that ladder?
I froze. My hands trembled. What are you talking about?
Do you think I don't know why you did it? Does she even know about me?
I didn't say anything else. I stared at her for another few seconds, like my feet were glued to the ground, and then I turned on my heel and I ran. I ran out of the hospital, ignoring the nurses and the receptionist calling out to me to come back. I burst out of the door into the cool evening air, my muscles screaming, and only then did I dare to look back. I had half expected her to be behind me, chasing me, her eyes wide and bulging and her teeth sharp. Nothing. There was no one. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out, cursing loudly, and sent the call to voicemail. The fear struck me again. I swiped to my unopened voicemails and I pressed on my oldest one, the one from that day when I was waiting for my wife to be ready to go home after her accident. My hand shook uncontrollably, and had to hold on with both of them to keep from dropping my phone. "Hi, baby. Are you busy? I know you said not to call you at this number. I wish you would answer me. Something's going on. I don't know. Maybe I'm just sick or something. Something's going on with my eyes." And that was my wife suffered a head injury. Now she has 4 pupils instead of 2, by Orange PLR. Now, I found this to be quite interesting because initially the title of the story kind of drew me to it, and I was like, oh, multiple pupils, that's kind of interesting. Is that potentially a real thing? And then in the story they mentioned polychoria, and I was like, is that an actual thing? Like, or is it just a made up word based on Latin and stuff? And no, it turns out it's true. Polychoria is indeed a thing. It's also known as a true polychoria. It's distinguished by the presence of a sphincter muscle around each iris hole, permitting synchronous constriction and dilation of the 2 pupils. But in some cases, it can be more than 2 pupils. Yeah. It's apparently a pathological condition of the eye, which could even be part of a disease, you know? I don't think science has fully figured out exactly how people can get it. But yeah, it's just crazy. And as you can imagine, it does affect their vision. You know, like, they might not have quite the same kind of vision levels like we would, obviously, because we see out of 1 pupil, for example. I'm not sure if that means they could see out of both at the same time. That would be so strange, wouldn't it? But then it also makes you wonder if they can have it in both eyes at the same time or just one. Because it's not like the color changing one, hexachroma, I forget the name of it. But like, you know, how, or heterochroma, something like that. How people can have like different colored irises. But I don't think that's quite the case. I think in this one it is just literally something about the visibility prospects, which is really fascinating. If anything, I had no idea it was such a thing. I'm sure I'll link a little photo in as well. It might even be the thumbnail for all we know. It's really fascinating. So anyway, it's also storming, by the way, here. So don't be surprised if you hear some thunder. So what I found to be really interesting as well about this story is it's another one of those that I think story tells really well how you don't get all the information right away. You slowly uncover bits and pieces of the story until you truly know what's going on at the end. You know what I mean? I like those kind of things because then you still have something to look forward to, something to piece together. Certain things make sense ahead of time and you could probably guess certain things, but sometimes they throw you a curveball, you know? Like the fact he was clearly cheating on his wife. Like, horrible. And then the fact that he was potentially trying to kill her. But at the same time, if you're going to try to kill somebody, a ladder inside a house is probably not the way to do it. I mean, obviously, I don't know for sure if that would do it. I haven't tried to kill anybody. You keep your mouth shut. I'm kidding. Seriously, no. That's not in my blood. I don't think I could do such a thing. But it's just, when you really think about it, you're like, that's such a silly thing. Out of all the ways to potentially kill somebody, pulling out screws of a ladder inside a house. Like, if it's a ladder that's, like, outside where they go, like, super tall and everything, I feel like that'd be way more dangerous. But what do I know? I think it's strange. But I found the story to be interesting because it's not like there's any creepy demonic things. We don't know what was going on because even the woman he was having an affair with, her eyes were becoming strange as well. So is there perhaps some kind of a curse at play? Is there some kind of a supernatural entity that's causing these things? Because it couldn't be a disease, because why would they both have it unless he is the one transmitting it, perhaps even sexually? Interesting. Could be. We don't know for sure. All we know is that both of the women in his life have it. Based on the voicemail at the end, we know that the person he's having an affair with has it. Very, very interesting. I thought it was really good because it's yet again, it's not a typical kind of a horror situation. It's more of it's a somewhat psychological, but also a bit of a supernatural, freaky element to it that's not fully understandable and explained. But it does it really well because it's still the horror of like something known, but also different. Still unknown, but not crazy unknown. It's really interesting. It's like the horror aspect of like you don't truly know who your neighbor is, sort of a thing. Like it's comfortable, but it's also you don't know what could happen, right? I think it's great. I think it's super, super great. Really enjoyed the story. Really glad I got to cover it. And I sure hope you've enjoyed it too. Oh, multiple pupils. Ugh. Kind of want to meet somebody who has them now. I kind of do. I kind of want to like talk to somebody who has polychoria. Do you have polychoria? Or do you perhaps know somebody who has polychoria? I would love to chat with you. Leave me a comment. I'm so curious now. I'm so curious. This has been great. This has been Nate at Night. I've had a wonderful time. I sure hope you have too. And we'll see you for whatever's next. Take care. Never again will I go backcountry camping. This is my personal account of an incident that occurred in Alaska back in 2019. I haven't spoken of this incident to anyone but my therapist and my best friend. Despite many sessions, and even attempts of exposure therapy, which I will explain later, this event still haunts me. Maybe if I post this here, I can gain some semblance of peace. So, like I said, it was 2019. I was 25 at the time. I had been saving up money to do on some backcountry camping up in Alaska. I live on the East Coast, and while my job was paying alright, I was taking up some under-the-table jobs, house painting, house sitting, pet sitting, and what have you, to help me out financially for the trip. I also had a friend set me up with their uncle, who was a bush pilot, to handle getting me to and from my camping location. This was my first and biggest mistake. Now, I had very little experience with camping outside of occasional weekend camping at state parks, and I did some camping excursions, nothing super challenging, when I was in Boy Scouts. But my friend's uncle, Mark, knew some good spots that were remote to an extent, but easy to get to in the event of an emergency. By bush plane standards, that is. So, yeah, no trekking to the nearest highway or road unless I wanted to walk for a day or so through rugged terrain. My parents helped me out with getting some emergency supplies, food, hydration packs, first aid kit, bear spray, etc. Mark loaned me a spare rifle of his in case I would need it. Even though I was a non-resident, I could still carry a firearm under state law. I've hunted before when I was a teen, so I had experience in that regard. Plus, I didn't have to worry about the hassle of transporting a firearm and dealing with airport regulations. Mark also hooked me up with a satellite phone as well, so my cell phone was going to be nothing more than a camera. I didn't have the money for a good camera for photography or anything, so I had to make do. The plan was to be dropped off at where I was camping, camp out for 5 days, and be picked up on day 6. I didn't want to use up all my 2 weeks of my allotted PTO at work, so I kept the trip condensed. Because this was my first time out, Mark helped me pick out a site, based on his recommendations. The spot he chose wasn't one he went to often, as he typically flew in hunters and anglers who typically were going to areas with more rugged terrain. It was relatively flat, not a lot of dense forests, maybe some patches here and there further in, and my campsite was going to be set up near a small lake with a good view of some mountains in the distance. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know where I was specifically, but Mark no longer takes people to that location, regardless of their experience or not. and he no longer does fly-ins for anyone who isn't a hunter. It hurt his business a bit because fishing is so popular in Alaska, but he ended up retiring altogether due to COVID the following year. As for why, I won't mention the location. As far as I am aware, the location didn't have a name on an official map, and if Mark had ever flown near that area, it was just a tiny blip during a scenic sightseeing trip. The other reason was because of what I experienced on that trip. What I saw, I wish I could get it out of my head, out of my dreams. After Mark dropped me off and helped me unload my gear, I spent most of my first day setting up camp, not far from the lake, a good 85 yards or so, or a little over 77 meters. I found a nice and remarkably dry dead log that had some good-sized branches, so that was my main supply of firewood. A short walk away, there was a small grove of trees, inland from the lake that I had set up to use as my food storage location. Mark said bears were not uncommon in this area, though not necessarily the best place to see some, but it was still advised to keep food hanging from a tree, out of reach from any potential bears. The lake had a rather unique shape to it, which made it easy for me to set up a good spot for a cooking area. For those unfamiliar, the campsite, food storage, and kitchen area should form a triangle, which some people refer to as a Bermuda Triangle. Day 2 and 3 were not entirely uneventful for the most part. Day 2, I was eating lunch at my campsite while watching a bull moose dive into the lake to eat the plants at the bottom. Day 3, I did some hiking, found a small hill with only a couple of trees on top, and I decided to sit down and observe a herd of elk grazing for a good while. Exploring around the lake, I found a small rusted boat buried under some branches. It was in rough shape, but could still float on the water, so I dragged it back with me to camp and put it near the lake shore. Figured I could go out on the lake and take some good photos from it. Day 4 is when things started to get weird. It got unnaturally quiet that morning. The birds were not singing, and the only sounds were from the lake, and the bugs. Despite making sure I packed mosquito repellent, the bugs were a big nuisance if I was near the lake. I hesitated to travel away from my tent, outside of walking to the lake. I tried not to let the silence bother me, and I occupied my time with reading inside my tent. As the sun dipped down and darkness began to creep in, I was starting to feel uneasy, like a primal kind of fear. I decided I was going to make my campfire a bit bigger than I normally make it, enough that the light shone further away. As I turned in for the night, I made sure my bear spray and the rifle were within reach inside my tent. But I had trouble sleeping. The silence was unnerving. I was fighting myself not to toss and turn, because I was too afraid of the noise attracting something I did not want to encounter alone at night. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard a branch snap. That woke me up faster than a bucket of ice water, and I immediately froze. I could hear something coming into my campsite. I reached for the bear spray and held it tightly to my chest. As slowly as humanly possible, I turned over and saw the shadow of an animal on the wall of my tent, illuminated by the glow of the moonlight. The animal was big, about the size of a trophy brown bear, but the silhouette looked off. I just figured it was from some sort of distortion from the angle I was looking at. But the noises it made were not like that of a bear. It made huffing noises like a bear, but the sound wasn't exactly the same. I could tell it was starting to approach my tent, so I had my thumb ready on the safety catch of the spray. Suddenly, the creature tore through the tent like tissue paper and grabbed my sleeping bag in its jaws. The strength of the animal caused me to nearly hit my head off the ground, and for a brief moment, I caught a look at the animal's face. The animal's head looked similar to a bear's, but there was something uncanny about it. Uncanny in a way that I could not entirely articulate. It wasn't malformed or anything, it just looked off. As the animal dragged me out of the tent, I popped off the safety catch and sprayed it in the face. The animal reeled back, groaning in pain. It was a horrendous noise, not like anything I have ever heard. I heard it run off into the thick brush, and as I went to head for the remains of my tent, I could hear this crashing and cracking noise from the animal. I was too scared that it was going to come back, so I ran for the boat. As I was pushing the boat into the water, I turned back, and from the fading glow of the campfire, I saw the animal begin to charge. I wasted no time in getting the boat into the water, and I began to paddle as quickly as I could. I knew the creature would be faster, but I was praying that I got far enough away from shore it wouldn't attempt to chase me. The creature didn't stop at the lake shore, and it made its way through the water, at least up to its chest, and stopped. I could faintly see it from the moonlight, and then it ran for my tent. While I couldn't see it all that well, I could tell from the horrendous noise that the animal was thrashing around my camping supplies. I hoped to God that the rifle and satellite phone were intact. I curled up in the boat and tried my best to sleep, but I was drenched up to my waist, and I was shivering like crazy. After a good 15 minutes, the noises from my campsite died down, and everything became still again. I never slept through the night, but occasionally would paddle the boat to make sure it didn't float off towards shore during the night. When morning approached, I was still too afraid to go back to my campsite. I waited until around noon, when my stomach began to protest. I picked up the paddle and slowly and as quietly as possible paddled back to my campsite. As I reached the shore, I still waited for several minutes, just to make sure I didn't hear the creature approach. I slowly walked back to what remained of my campsite. The tent was nothing more than snapped poles and tattered fabric, and what was left of my sleeping bag was unrecognizable as belonging to a sleeping bag. Unfortunately, Mark's rifle had a busted stock, and the wooden forearm had a big crack down it. My backpack had been torn apart, and clothes and gear were scattered all around. I found my binoculars laying in the fire pit, luckily. It looked like the fire had gone out before they landed in it, as there were no scourge marks on them. One of the lenses was cracked, but were still usable. I scoped out the food cache area, only to find my food cache missing, and some busted branches around the trees. I quickly grabbed a small backpack that was missing a strap, and quickly stuffed some clothes into it and the binoculars. I searched around the campsite for anything else of use. The satellite phone was still in its pouch in what was left of the larger backpack, so I grabbed that, and a couple of emergency flares. I would pause every few moments just to make sure the creature from last night didn't show up. My bear spray can lay over by the dead log, and as I went over to grab it, that's when I heard a low growl coming from the thicket. I froze. If I had been wearing a t-shirt at the time, I would have seen the goosebumps that covered my arms. I slowly began backing away from my campsite, back to the rusted boat, and that's when it emerged from the brush. It had the appearance of a bear, but like how you would probably envision a bear in your dreams. It had an uncanniness to its appearance that I am unable to describe. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and part of me was, and still is, wondering if the sleepless night was messing with my vision. My legs were beginning to shake, and tears were streaming down my face as it watched me. I was terrified of what it might do next. The animal lumbered towards me, and I tossed a lit flare at it, in the hopes it would scare the creature off. It backed off momentarily. I took the opportunity to run for the boat. Bad idea when dealing with a predator, I know. But I managed to get the boat back towards the deeper water as it stopped at chest level water like the night before. The animal watched me, its eyes burning with an intense fury that I have never seen in an animal before. It ran back to shore and turned, and began swiping at the ground with its paws. When I saw the claws, I dreaded to think what injuries they would be capable of inflicting on me. I reached down to grab the paddle, only to find it gone. I looked up to see it laying on the pebbly surface of the shoreline. I began to cry. I was typically not an emotional person at the time, but here I could do nothing but bawl my eyes out. I was absolutely terrified. I looked around, and I saw what appeared to be a branch from a dead tree jutting out of the water not far from shore, but seemingly far enough away the animal wouldn't reach me unless it was very determined. I used my hands to clumsily steer the boat towards it, and could see the creature lumbering along the shoreline, following me. I screamed at it to go away, but the animal was unfazed by my shouts and screams. When I reached the branch, I looked up and saw that the animal was gone. I looked around the shoreline. I wasn't terribly far from where my campsite had been, and I didn't see any trace of the creature. I accidentally kicked my foot back and heard a thud. I froze, and again I heard the crashing and snapping of branches in the thicket. I pushed the boat away from the log and back towards the deeper water. The creature again appeared on the shoreline and let out a horrendous sounding roar. I never heard an animal sound like that before. It was such an awful roar that I flinched in fear. I bent over and clamped my hands around my ears. I was doing everything to keep the image and sound of that animal out of my head. I was cold, wet, and alone in the Alaskan wilderness, and I was being terrorized by something that was an indescribable approximation of a bear. I heard my foot thud again, and I felt around, at first thinking it was part of the boat. I felt a handle, and out from under my seat was a metal box with a padlock on it that wasn't even locked. I carefully took off the padlock and opened the box, and inside was a vintage camping shovel. Looked to be military surplus. It wasn't perfect, but the closest alternative to a paddle. I slowly began heading down the lake towards a river. I looked over my shoulder, and the creature was continuing to follow me. I had never seen an animal this intent before. My mind was racing through so many thoughts. Was it an animal? A monster? I reached into my pack and pulled out the satellite phone. Battery still had enough juice, and I immediately called Mark and, despite my sobbing voice and him trying to calm me down, said he'd get out to me as soon as he can and told me to keep an eye on the creature. Mark believed I was being stalked by a bear. Once again, the sun began to dip down, and I was enveloped in darkness as clouds started to block out the moon. Somehow, I was able to fall asleep. Woke up once in the middle of the night, thinking the animal had gotten to me, but after an excruciatingly long period of silence, waved it off as a fish. When dawn came, I found my boat started to drift towards shore. I looked around, didn't see any sign of the animal. I gathered my remaining belongings and, after looking for landmarks that Mark advised me on, trekked to where he was going to meet me at. That was the scariest 3 hours of my life. All I could think of was that animal stalking me. I completely forgot to even be aware of other animals like moose. As I crested a hilltop, I could see Mark's plane in a flat meadow, and I just booked it for the plane as fast as I was able to. Mark rushed over and helped me with my belongings, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Once again, I heard the familiar crashing sound of something in the brush near the hill I was on, and Mark readied his rifle as I got into the plane. We both saw the animal rear up on its hind legs and roar at us. Again, the way it was postured was so different from how a bear stands up. Mark quickly hopped in the plane just as the animal charged. However, Mark was able to get his plane airborne long before the animal could reach us, and I only caught one last glimpse of it before it fled back into the brush. I asked Mark what was wrong with that bear, and he just replied, his voice shaking, something I had never seen the 61-year-old man do in the time I knew him. I don't know what that was, but that wasn't a fucking bear. After we reached civilization, Mark swore he would never bring anyone to that area again, and I would be his first and last camper flight. I think we both regret the inexperience. Alaska Fish and Game were notified of the situation, but when they investigated the scene, they found only the remains of the campsite and some of my gear. They did recover some items that were still usable, but unfortunately, due to heavy rainstorms a few days after the incident, they could not find any footprints, or even fur, of the creature. Officially, it was logged as a bear incident. And with Mark explaining that the region wasn't particularly a prime area for excursions, Fish and Game decided there was no need to look into it further. Mark and I are the only ones to have seen this creature, and unfortunately, neither of us were able to describe the animal to Fish and Wildlife, because both of us would break down into tears before we could get far enough into the description. When I came back to the continental US, I went through a few years of therapy, mostly video calls due to COVID, but after things started opening back up, my therapist was taking me to zoos to see bears for exposure therapy, but it was fruitless. People thought I just had a scary encounter with a big brown bear, but I know better. There's something up there in Alaska. I don't know what it is, but I pray to God every day that someone else doesn't have a run-in with it. And that was Never Again Will I Go Backcountry Camping by one moray. That's a moray? Ha! Or a moray eel, maybe. Hard to tell. So, we have to sadly get the negative out of the way first. It was a little tricky to read at parts. It was a little difficult, a little painful, I'm afraid. It's also got the curse of, like, bizarre grammar, which is fine, you're probably not the best at literature, language. Not everybody is. Totally understandable. Grammarly is a great thing to use. Totally should. Very helpful to make sure that sentences make a bit more sense. I know I use it myself. Not always, but, helpful. It's also one of those stories which sadly has the details in the wrong, focus. You know what I mean? So in this case, we get the description of the creature. We don't get any alternative name, just that it's an uncanny bear-type thing. We don't get any detail about, maybe the fur or anything. It just kept describing it as, bear-like. Not a bear, but bear-like. It was always bear-like. Oh, it was similar to a bear. But there was no further detail, and somehow this creature was clearly so different and horrifying that it traumatized both them and Mark. And yet, we got zero other description. Not even, maybe the teeth were bigger, or maybe the fur was a bizarre color, or maybe it was, patchy fur, or maybe, the limbs were longer in certain ways. It was, zero description of the creature, which is obviously one of the biggest driving forces of the story. So it's a bit of a shame. And yet, you get a lot of detail in so many other things that it's like you don't need so much detail on all these other things if the main driving force has next to nothing. It's a shame. It's a real shame because it kind of weakens the story a little bit. It just felt like it was sadly an animal encounter gone wrong, which in a sense it is, of course, but this is more like a cryptid. But the thing about a cryptid is you want to know as much as you can about it. It's the bizarre details that make you interested in the cryptid, because otherwise you're like, could have been an animal, could have been a person, whatever. Less interesting, you know what I mean? Whereas if Mothman attacked you or a Bigfoot, people tend to give you a lot of detail about it. And you're like, well, what do you mean it had wings? What do you mean it had glowing red eyes? What do you mean it, had like massive feet or something? There's certain weird things that just kind of make it more interesting. And sadly, that wasn't quite here. It's a shame. It's a real shame because with a bit more of that, I think it would have been great. But besides that, I thought it was a pretty good little story. A little bit of Alaskan wilderness, a bizarre camping trip gone wrong. Felt short, but also not. Very strange how that weirdly works. You know what I mean? Because, luckily, the main focus was on the encounters, and I thought that was the right call. Absolutely. Yeah. I also found it strange that they were like, oh, well, we're definitely the only ones who've ever seen this creature. Well, we don't know that for sure, do we? There are plenty of people who have terrible situations happen to them, encounters, what have you, that don't tell their stories. So you can't just say that. You can believe it, you can think it, but you don't know. You don't know for damn sure. Anyway, besides that, I did enjoy the story. I did enjoy the story. I like the idea of like a camping trip gone wrong, something crazy happening in the wilderness, a cabin in the woods, things of that kind of nature. Bodies of water in any kind of a story is usually really horrifying because there's always the fear of like, oh, there could be more than one kind of a problem. There's also the potential of drowning and stuff like that. Interesting. It just adds an extra elemental layer, in my opinion. It's really cool. I feel pretty good about this. I apologize about the different change. I've just got a second screen. I'm kind of still playing around with designs and seeing what works best. So bear with me. I'm sure this camera angle will change. Who knows? I haven't decided yet. I gotta play around with stuff. Anyway, I've been Nate at Night. I've had a lot of fun, and I really hope you have too. We will see you for whatever is next. Take care, peeps. My daughter was terrified of cryptids. My 9-year-old daughter, Abby, has had a weird fear of mythical creatures for a while now. I blame her mother, my ex, for giving her unrestricted access to the internet at a young age. I began to grow tired of constantly having to check under her bed and in her wardrobe for monsters every time she stayed at mine for the weekend, and even had to invest in a nightlight to help her sleep. When she was younger, I was understanding. Lots of kids are afraid of the dark and things that go bump in the night. But as the years went on, this started to irritate me. It had gotten to the point where she didn't want to sleep by herself, couldn't sleep in the dark, and absolutely refused to step outside at night. 2 weekends ago, Abby and I fell out because she point-blank refused to take the trash out after dinner because it was dark. This led to me growing frustrated, as she only had to take 5 steps out the door. But she dug her heels in. During that week, I decided enough was enough, and planned to take her camping in the forest for the weekend, to get her away from all the nonsense online and face her fears. I ordered Abby some walking shoes, hiking trousers, a thermal jumper, and some cheap t-shirts to pack for our weekend. Abby basically has an entire wardrobe of clothes she keeps here, but I didn't want her to complain if her clothes got dirty or damaged. I left work a bit earlier on Friday to prepare, packing a bag for myself and my daughter for our trip. I loaded up the car and made my way to my ex's house to collect Abby. Abby greeted me at the door, and I held out a carrier bag full of hiking clothes. "Hey you, go and put these on." I smile, handing her the bag.
What is it?
She asks, peeking into the bag. "Walking gear," I tell her. "We're going on an adventure." As Abby ran upstairs to get changed, my ex Martha sauntered to the door, her new partner Steve following behind. "Hello, Paul. Hope you're well." Martha smiled half-heartedly, with Steve offering me a nod of hello. We engaged in pleasantries for a while, when Martha asked me what our plans were for the weekend. "Camping," I tell her in a low voice, "under the guise of a brisk hike." "Oh, Paul, no," Martha frowns, shaking her head. "You know what she's like with the dark." Ah, leave him be, Moth, Steve chimed in, giving me a nod of approval. It'll bloody do the girl some good. My father would have done the same. Martha pursed her lips, as if thinking of a counter-argument, before her shoulders dropped in defeat. Well, I guess. Just look after her, Paul, she told me sternly. She'll be all right, Steve assured her before I could respond, rubbing her shoulder. Don't you fret. Abby returned to the door not long after. How's it fit? I asked her.
Well, the shoes fit fine,
She replied, lifting her foot out in front of her.
but the trousers are a little long, and the fleece is kind of big.
She wasn't wrong, but I put it down to the unpredictability of online shopping. Looks all right to me, Steve said, giving me a final nod farewell before my daughter and I retreated to the car.
Dad, this hike's taking ages.
Abby whined, her arms swinging by her sides. It's only been a couple of hours. Usually you're full of energy, I chuckled. We carried on walking until we reached a large clearing. Here will do, I announced, sliding the backpack from my shoulders. Abby looked at me perplexed.
For what?
The campsite, I smiled. Abby's eyes widened.
What?
She snapped.
Tell me you're joking.
Oh, don't be dramatic, I told her. Didn't you catch on when I got this huge bag out of the car? Abby began to panic, explaining to me how it will be dark soon and we need to leave. Hey now, calm down, I assured her gently. We won't make it back to the car before dark anyways. Let's set up camp and we'll get a big fire going. I've bought marshmallows. The tent was up. Baked beans and hot dogs were eaten, and we sat around the campfire with marshmallows on sticks. See? I smiled at her. This isn't so bad. Isn't it nice to be away from screens and pollution?
I guess.
Want a soda? I asked, pulling 2 cans of sugary drink from my bag. Abby raised an eyebrow.
After 7? You and Mom never let me have soda after 7.
I nodded. Yeah, I guess you're right. I thought you might want one as a treat. But, like you said...
No!
Abby yelled playfully, as I pretended to put the sodas away. I handed her a can and we both resumed our places at opposite ends of the fire, our sodas letting out a hiss as we pulled the tabs. So, how comes you so scared of the dark? I asked her, pulling my packet of cigarettes from my pocket and lighting one. Abby ran her finger around the rim of the can.
You know why.
Monsters, I reply. Abby nodded without looking up.
Do you believe in monsters?
She asked me. I shook my head. Nah, well, I don't believe in the kind of monsters you do with claws and horns. I believe some bad people can be monsters, though.
I don't believe in those kinds of things.
Abby told me. I raised an eyebrow. So what sorts do you believe in? Abby looked down at her can again, prodding the tab with her finger.
Have you ever heard of the hermits?
The what? I asked, a slight chuckle escaping my lips.
The hermits.
My daughter repeated. Can't say I have. Abby pulled her phone from her bag, opening a folder in a picture gallery and handing me the phone. I put my can down next to me and began flicking through. The first image was a drawing of a humanoid creature, but its ears were slightly pointed and its eyes were a pale white with pupils like a snake. It had locks of thin, white, greasy hair. It looked as though its nose had been removed, and it was drawn wearing only a white shred of cloth around its groin. The second was a realistic-looking image similar to the drawing. It had long, sharp fingernails and was grinning with pointy yellow teeth. It was thin, and seemed to hunch over, with grayish skin and a hairless body. This image didn't show it wearing the shredded white cloth. Instead, it appeared to have a small, bulging pouch, similar to a kangaroo, where a human would have their reproductive parts. I scrolled to the next image, which was mostly text with 2 different sketches of the creature. One looked more male, and the other female, with a slightly fattier chest, a pouch that went sideways, and a more flexible, hunched-over stance. I flicked my finger across the screen to the next image, which showed local statistics of missing children and hikers who vanished without a trace, with some locations and images of victims. What followed this image was a screenshot of a written text. The hermits generally reside in woodlands and farmland where they can easily acquire food. The hermit's usual source of food is bone marrow of larger mammals, such as livestock, mainly cattle, horses, deer, and humans. The The hermits are attracted to the smell of blood. Some say they can smell it from up to a mile away, although this hasn't yet been proven. The hermits are social predators, which follow similar pack rankings as we give to wolves. The hermits don't tend to follow the usual pack gender roles, with both males and females engaging in similar activity and ranks for both sexes. I continued flicking through the album, which showed more sketches, pictures, and grainy camera footage. Huh. They are pretty creepy, I admitted. But they're not real. There's been all kinds of folklore around since I was a kid. Used to scare me a bit too, but it's just make-believe. Abby frowned at me as I handed her phone back.
It's not fake, Dad. I've seen them. They roam the woods at the back of the house.
I chuckled. That's so? As I moved my arm, a pointy branch from the log I was sitting on snagged the sleeve of my fleece, pulling some thread out. Damn it! I hissed, raising my arm to inspect the damage. Abby suddenly jumped up.
Did you cut yourself?
She squealed. No, I just got my fleece caught in a stake, I told her. Abby went into a tirade about checking my arm for cuts to ensure it's not bleeding.
They can smell blood. They target the wounded for an easy kill.
I looked at her and sighed. Kid, let's just get ready for bed. I turned in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable. The dim yellow beam from the flashlight which Abby had insisted we hang from the roof of the tent was all that illuminated our shelter. I was about to drift off when I felt my shoulder being poked.
Dad, I have to wee.
I turned and sat up in my warm sleeping bag. Okay, go ahead and take the light. Don't go too far.
Can you come with me?
Abby asked awkwardly. You're plenty old enough to do these things by yourself, I told her, already unzipping my sleeping bag, knowing my fate was sealed. I grabbed the flashlight and climbed out of the tent, aiming the light at a large tree. Here, you take the light. Just go behind that tree over there. I turned around and took a deep, tired breath, feeling the crisp air caress my face. My daughter returned, her face pale.
Dad, something's wrong.
What's wrong?
I think I'm bleeding.
What? Where? Did you get a scratch? I got a first aid kit if it's bad, and Abby cut me off by pointing to her lap.
There.
She looked at me, visibly upset and uncomfortable. It took me a moment before it clicked. Oh. Yeah, no, don't worry, it's normal. That's just something you get at a certain age. Ah, shit, what a place for it to happen. I retreated back to the tent to try and find something to help my daughter. Did you unpack you any toiletries in your weekend bag? I called out to her, dragging my bag out of the tent. Abby shook her head, her eyes beginning to water. Shit, okay, it's alright. Don't get upset about it, I assured her gently. I got a load of tissues and some bandages. That should see you through until we leave. Here, go in the tent and get changed into some clean undies. I'll wait out here. Abby vanished into the tent as I took some deep breaths, hoping I handled the situation okay. Abby came out of the tent a few moments later. I left my weekend bag in the car, she informed me sadly. It'll be okay. I'll wash everything tomorrow whilst you have a nice bath, I smiled. Abby offered me a half-hearted smile before her face fell.
They'll smell it.
Huh?
The hermits.
They won't. Let's try to get some sleep. I was woken by a scream. I sat upright, looking in the darkness at my daughter's sleeping bag. It was empty. I fought my way out of my sleeping bag and dove out the open tent. Abby! Abby! I shouted, looking around. I spotted the beam of a flashlight coming from behind the large tree Abby had used earlier and ran over. Abs, are you okay? Abby didn't reply, her shaking hand pointing the light into the tree line. I slowly took the flashlight from her trembling palm, rubbing her shoulders reassuringly. Sweetie, what's happened?
I dropped my bracelet here earlier. I didn't want to wake you, so I thought I'd be brave and go get it.
Abby's voice shook with fear as she pinched her bracelet between her fingers tightly. Why did you scream? Did something scare you? I asked her, gently taking the bracelet from her fingers and putting it in my pocket. I expected her to say she heard a twig snap or an animal call. Abby slowly pointed in front of us.
It's behind that tree.
Confused, I raised the light to where she was pointing, just in time to see a figure step backwards out of sight. "What the fuck?" I said out loud, a mixture of fear and anger in my voice. Before I could think, I called out into the night, demanding to know who was out there. Abby clung onto my waist as we stood frozen in place.
Daddy.
Before Abby could say anything, a large branch snapping behind us caused us to spin around. I shone the light in all directions, unable to see anything. A screech rang out from the trees as we heard twigs snap all around us. "Let's go back to the tent," I whisper. Looking back, I feel the shelter was a false sense of security, but I knew I had a small survival knife in my bag. We slowly walked backwards towards the tent, small embers of our fire offering the campsite a hint of light. My daughter began walking backwards to the tent when I grabbed her arm. A filthy, gray foot slowly disappeared into our tent. Abby gasped, unable to scream due to fear. Time stood still. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears as I held my breath. The crunching sound of a stick behind us was enough to break me from my terrified trance. "Run!" I hissed, practically dragging my daughter by her arms through the bracken and into the tree line. Screeching rang out behind us, but I didn't look back. I could hear heavy rustling behind us.
Daddy, they're in the trees!
Abigail screamed. "Just keep running!" I barked, my eyes locked in front of us. My hand latched tightly to her arm as I pulled her along. Abby tripped, causing my body to jerk and the flashlight to escape my grip. I pulled her back up in a second, and we continued fleeing, not wasting any time to pick up our only source of light. I desperately pleaded that this route would lead us back to the car, or at least out of danger, but my stomach dropped and I put my foot in front of me to hastily decelerate. The steep edges of a deep ravine, lit up by the moonlight, trapped us. "Fuck!" I hissed, rapidly turning my head in both directions before deciding to continue right.
Daddy!
Abby cried as I began to tug her. Pointing to where I was pulling her, I looked. A long, grey, bony hand with sharp black fingernails slowly disappeared behind a tree in front of us. I stopped, pushing Abby behind me in a protective stance. Branches broke all around us as screeches took over the forest. My daughter gripped my hand as figures began slowly peering at us from behind the trees, their long, thin, white hair hanging down illuminated in the moonlight, and their eyes reflected light like an animal. A low, rumbling snarl from behind us seemed to silence the forest. I turned my head to see a hunched creature hunting us on all fours, its back low to the ground. It got closer, stood on 2 feet, and sniffed the air, before looking at my daughter and letting out a gurgling grin. Sharp, yellow teeth filled its mouth. I pushed Abby behind me, encasing her between my body and a tree. "Get back!" I yelled, holding my shoulders high. The creature looked at me, its slit pupils growing slightly as it slowly crept into the moonlight.
Daddy!
Abigail screamed. I turned around to see a long grey arm latched to my daughter's waist, trying to pull her up the tree. I began punching, clawing, and twisting the arm, desperately trying to pry it from my daughter. I suddenly felt a heavy impact on my back, and I began falling. The creature in the moonlight had hit me so hard I'd been thrown into the ravine. My body bashed against the rocky edges of the ravine as I rolled down the muddy edges and into an ankle-deep stream below. I tripped on rocks as I fought to stand, a sharp pain in my foot as I twisted it falling. The screams of my daughter rang out from above. I desperately clawed at the edges of the ravine, grabbing at roots and rocks to climb back up. But I couldn't. "Abigail!" I screamed helplessly, scraping my fingernails across the rocks and frantically seeking for somewhere to climb. The trees rustled and branches creaked from above me, the screeches of the creatures and my daughter's cries beginning to grow faint. "Daddy!" "No! No! Abigail!" I walked through the ravine until morning light, when I found a spot I could climb. Dazed, I blinked into the sunrise. I continued briskly limping until I got to my car, plucking my car keys from my fleece pocket and collapsing into the driver's seat. I punched the steering wheel, tears welling up in my eyes as I turned the key in the ignition and began speeding into town. I filed a police report. Police didn't believe me at first, but eventually confessed they'd had a lot of strange reports from those woods. They believe it's a group of sick individuals in costumes targeting hikers and campers, even though I insisted that's not possible. No trace of Abby has been found. I live in hope that she got away somehow and will someday come back. Our campsite was discovered torn to shreds. Police did a thorough search through the forest and found the skeletal remains of some of the missing hikers. The bones had been snapped and were riddled with teeth marks. Police think an animal got to them. Martha blames me and has since demanded no contact. I can't say I blame her. I couldn't keep our daughter safe. I live with that guilt every day. I wish I could go back in time and just stay home that weekend. This story doesn't end with me hearing things in the night or seeing faces at my window. I haven't been to a woods since, and keep my house well lit at all times. Abby, if you're out there and you read this, I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. You were my reason to get up every morning, my push to get me through the week, and my reason to smile. Life isn't as bright without you. I've still got your bracelet. I keep it on my nightstand, so it's the first thing I see when I wake up, and the last thing I see before I go to sleep. Please come back, Abs. I'm scared of cryptids too. And that was My Daughter Was Terrified of Cryptids by Tumbleweed Passes. So, this is interesting because I obviously I know a couple of different cryptids and cryptozoology, kind of things like that. And I couldn't find anything that fully matched the description of these creatures, which is cool, because if anything, it could be like a whole new concept, new idea, or whatever. It sounds similar to, obviously, something like the rake, which is obviously not a real thing. It's, you can call it cryptid if you want, doesn't really matter. It's not a real thing. But or some kind of like weird elvish, gnomish, angry creature boys. Kind of weird. I don't know, but then there's multiple of them, right? So that there's a whole, like, it's almost like they're a species of something. It makes me think of like a horror film like The Descent. I think that's the one I'm thinking of. The one in the cave. Hang on, I gotta confirm that now. Because if so, then yeah, it is The Descent I'm thinking of, where it's you got like these weird humanoid like creatures in the cave and everything, and a great horror film, absolutely great horror film if you haven't seen it. Totally creepy as hell. Yeah, definitely worth a watch in October if you haven't. 100% recommend The Descent. Great film. But yeah, so yeah, just weird humanoid-y kind of creatures that have their own kind of like tribal weird lifestyle. It's strange. But I enjoy that because, yet again, it's a thing that we don't know the full rules about it, the full scope of it. It's also very interesting that, you know, I mean, the more that you break down this story, she's supposed to be like 9 years old and she has a phone and she's looking up all this creepy stuff. So I'm kind of with the dude where I'm like, she's a bit too young to be, you know, fully exposed to the internet and things like that. I mean, this is exactly how you give kids nightmares and things. You know, I mean, just like 9 is a bit too young. You know what I mean? She's not even double digits. Not that I am raising kids nor have any capability of doing so. You know, this is just what I would personally think. It sounds crazy. But yet again, I could totally be wrong. But as a guy who's worked in the service industry a lot of my years, I've seen plenty of kids on devices, iPads, phones, whatever, whether it's their own or their parents or whatever, irrelevant. The fact is, I've seen a lot of it, and it just doesn't sit right. It just doesn't sit right. It doesn't really give them the right kind of social environment to be in, and I definitely feel like it does kind of change people's like communication skills. You know what I mean? Which is, it's not good. Anyway, we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the story. Otherwise, I think the story's pretty good. I've quite enjoyed it. You got plenty of good detail in the right places, which is good. You get a weird description of the creatures, which is obviously what we want to know. And yeah, there's some excellent details. Makes me think of like old school vampires, how they have multiple pointy teeth, but they're not really vampires. They suck on like the bone marrow of pretty much anything with bones, which is really interesting. Really interesting. Honestly, really good story. Tumbleweed Passage, you should be very proud. It's a good story, plenty of creep factor to it. Nothing too much, just the right kind of stuff that it feels like this is a believable post. Like if somebody pleading for help because they aren't getting any help. It's great. Honestly, really good story. Really pleased with that for the month of October. Spooky times are great. So far so good, man. We're having a good little time this month. Good little time. I hope you guys are having a great time. We've still got the Halloween costume contest thing. It's not really a contest. It's kind of fun. It's just going to let me rate and judge people's costumes. You know, I think it's going to be a fun little time. You can still submit the entries to the Discord. We're going to have we got the specific channel for it, so definitely pop your entries there, and I'll do a video / live stream. Hopefully by this point I've figured out what that is. I'm really not sure. But anyway, this has been it's been great fun. I've really enjoyed myself, and I sure hope you have too. This has been Nate at Night, and we will see you for whatever's next. Bye-bye. There's an empty house in my neighborhood with a chair facing a wall. For a cheeseburger, I went inside and sat there. It was a simple dare. Go and sit in the chair in the old doll maker's house. The house was scheduled to be destroyed as part of some wholesale renovation of the neighborhood. The old house is doomed to be torn down to make way for new, sleeker models. The doll maker had died a decade prior, and the house hadn't seen a single new tenant since. Something about the place was universally, though unidentifiably, disagreeable, unwholesome both within and without, and of course a local legend about it was eventually formed. The sole remaining piece of furniture in the house was a simple wooden chair, which faced a wall in the man's bedroom. A wall upon which strange lyrics in an unknown language had been written sometime during the latter, possibly senile years of owner's occupancy. The language was unidentifiable, and therefore thought to be gibberish, the insanely scrawled ravings of a man who had always been a little off-kilter even during his saner days. The cause of his death was said to be natural, but to sensationalize and propagate the legend, it was suggested that he'd actually been murdered by his dolls, none of which were ever found. I, of course, didn't believe it, and gladly accepted the challenge to enter the derelict house, sit in the singular chair, and recite the wall-scribbled nonsense, at the promise of a burger upon my return. Suspecting nothing, confident that I'd complete the challenge without issue, I entered the perpetually unlocked house, found the vacant room with its yellowed wallpaper and unshaded window, and sat in the chair. Only absent-mindedly did I notice the valleys of scratches in the armrests, as if fingernails had streaked across the wood in some panicked frenzy. I was simply too focused on the weird writing on the wall, which was definitely in a language, or an imitation of one, I'd never seen before. I spoke the rhythmically metered words to the best of my ability, expecting nothing. But then, in a flash of brilliant crimson, I felt myself suddenly and wholly dissolved into the air, as if the fiery light had swept through and disinterested me. Only an instant later, I found myself standing in a long and dark corridor, which was lined with pictures of strange figures posed oddly, disconcertingly, and all their faces were gone, scraped or etched away. Before I could move in either direction down the hall, one of the frames began to shake, and suddenly fell from the wall. The glass shattered upon impact, the sound of which was unusually and unnervingly loud in the doubly vast corridor. But the activity of the picture was not over. A black thing began to thickly bubble up from the shards of glass, and the image therein seemed to be at the core of the Stygian substance. Soon the substance took form, solidifying and lightening, and before long there stood a woman, clothed in the same simple white dress she'd been wearing in the framed picture. But unlike the picture, she had a face. Quite a beautiful one, white and luminous as a newly risen moon, with eyes like two calm abyssal seas, and shoulder-length sable hair. But, just when I was about to greet her, something horrible happened. Her face burst open, flesh flaps flowing outward, revealing a pest-infested skull, grinning hideously, evilly, the visage of a maniacal fiend. Things that weren't quite bugs yet bore a horrific, otherworldly resemblance to them squirmed or squelched with verminous excitement from the hollows between her facial bones, a brownish-green assemblage of sepulchral parasites. She started towards me, shambling down the dark corridor, bumping into the walls and knocking loose the pictures and wall sconces. Her blood-stained clothes slowly melted away like the wax off a candle, revealing a naked, sickeningly emaciated body, as if she'd gone without water and sustenance for days, weeks, leaving her pallid skin dehydrated and taut. Weirdly, she was sexless, and her stomach was likewise devoid of a navel. These minor observations I only recalled later. I inched backwards, my legs moving stiffly as if mired in slime. With each sconce she knocked over, the light in the hall diminished, growing dimmer and gloomier by the minute. The flames of the loosened candles were snuffed by the molten darkness that seemed to bubble up from between the floorboards, some residue of, or relative to, the same stuff that had brought her to life. Shadowy emanations rose to ankle length, obscuring the floor beneath me. Where they touched the tears in my jeans, I felt a coldness, as of a whipping winter wind. When a solid wall stopped my backwards progress, I screamed, thinking myself trapped with no way to escape the pale-skinned nightmare. Its body lurched and spasmed, convulsing mid-step, as it drew nearer and nearer. The facially embedded bouquet of vile, frothing pests throbbing with new glee at the prospect of my devourment. My eyes scanned the vast grey walls, the shadow-clung ceiling, the dirty carpeted floor, but I saw nothing with which to defend myself. No item or object to use as a weapon. 10 feet. 6. 3. Corpse slime and bile, intermingled into a sickeningly green sludge, leaked from its misaligned jaw. Its eyes, or rather, the pits where they should have been, burned with a deathly fire. The sorcerous blue embers of a necromantically reared lich. Eldritch insects entered and exited those pits at random, their carapaces gleaming in the infernal light. I raised my hands and closed my eyes, hoping to shield myself from the imminent attack, while also hoping that the end would be quick, painless. I swiftly dealt blow, rather than some slow, agonizing violence. I didn't want to see or feel it, just wanted the terror to end. Just when I smelled her hot, infinitely putrid breath, and felt the radiance of Hadean heat from her feverous body, I heard a voice, distant and meek, but oddly soothing. It spoke my name, softly and comfortingly, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a small, wispy sphere of light behind the creature, a few paces down the hall. Sensing a spirit or presence of salvation in that luminous orb, I mustered up a little courage, rekindling for the moment my animus to survive, and pushed away the faceless, malevolently grinning monster. It, fell to the side, catching the wall with one of her bloodied claw-like hands, and hissed venomously at me. But I was already rushing away towards the light, which had started to hover away. Following it, with that lich-like horror on my heels, I rounded corner after featureless corner in her ceaselessly shifting and maddeningly indistinguishable halls. Always, the light stayed a little ahead of me, just out of reach. And she, as tireless as she was malignant, pursued me without pause, hissing and shrieking all the while. Finally, the light led me to a door with a surface embossed with the decor of a hand clutching a hammer, which had seemed to appear seemingly out of nowhere, merely coming to sudden existence at the end of a long and nigh lightless corridor. The orb of light went through the door, and assuming that this meant I could open it, since there hadn't been any other doors, I quickened my pace with arms outstretched. And just as I had thought, I burst through, and without even taking a moment to inspect the room, turned and slammed the door shut. The horror beyond crashed into the door and proceeded to beat upon it savagely, but the frame in the door itself held, and I knew, somehow, that she would not be able to cross that particular threshold. For the moment, I was safe. Turning around, I saw that the light had changed. Rather than retain its former orb-like shape, it had expanded to become a sort of cloud form of light, brilliantly luminous and tinged with a golden hue. Its radiance slowly filled the room, illuminating the sparsely and anciently furnished office space. There was a desk, strewn with long, yellowed papers to my left, a bookcase loaded with old, virtually indistinguishable books, their covers long since faded, sat to my right. In the front of the room, beyond the still expanding light cloud, was a long work table, upon which had been placed several strange figures, wooden clay sculptures of hideous, monstrous things, small simulacra of the most unsettling creatures I'd ever seen. But what chilled me to my core, and brought forth a pervasive, mind-unshackling dread, was the familiarity of the last figure. Standing there, atop its little wooden base, arms outstretched in an unmistakably hostile embrace, was that ghastly woman, that lich-like, taut-skinned fiend who had tirelessly pursued me through the winding corridors. And at that moment I knew that I had, somehow, invoked or conjured her from the picture in the hall, which had undoubtedly been her vessel, her prison, for who knows how long. And, venturing further in my speculations upon the unreal, I guessed that these idols acted in some way as anchors of those framed horrors, vessels to which they could be bound, or otherwise ensorcelled, should they ever be freed from the pictures. I shuddered at the idea of setting free those other horrors, whose true images were represented by the figures on the table, demons and incubi and malformed, twisted abominations out of some warlock's black and profane reverie. God only knows how I hadn't summoned them in my recitation of those sorcerous lyrics upon the wall back at the home. Perhaps each required its own invocation or spell. Regardless, I knew that I had to destroy the idol, that I couldn't allow that hideous nightmare to freely roam the halls, lest some poor soul stumble upon the chair and tragically find himself transported to this cold, Tartarian otherworld. The goldenly beaming light then hovered a little over the table, and subsequently focused itself into a columnar scope, highlighting a bundle of tools. Gripping a small mallet that sat near to those abhorrent sculptures, I prepared myself for the destruction of the idol, and any ramifications of the act. I smiled to myself at the irony. The mallet had probably been used in some fashion to construct the horrible thing, and here I was about to destroy it with the very same tool. The providential light, apparently having accomplished what I set out to do, dissipated into the ether, somberly illuminating the room. Despite its utter lack of any anthropomorphic quality, I sensed that there had been a human quality about it, that it had, in some earlier state, been a person. Whom? I couldn't say, and have only a loose, unverifiable idea now. As if sensing the imminent undoing of its physical anchor to the mundane world, the undead avatar of that evil image howled from outside the door, throwing its piercing voice into the cold air. Its insane shrieking only compelled me onward, and with a mighty swing, I brought the mallet down onto the figure, smashing it to splinters. A dire and baleful tension filled the air, and I briefly felt as if I would lose consciousness from a sudden sense of intracranial pressure. But then, as abruptly as it had come, the feeling left me, and the foreboding tension evaporated, and the room was silent. It wasn't until a fragment of the destroyed figure fell to the floor, the impact echoing loudly in the curiously vaulted ceiling, that I noticed the horror had stopped screaming. With the mallet still gripped tightly in my hand, I moved to the door and placed my trembling free hand on the knob. With the mallet poised to strike, I threw open the door, and found myself facing the sallow wall of the old home. I spun around, but instead of finding the cold, cobweb-draped atelier, with its old books and mouldering furniture and work table, I instead saw the barren and sunlit room I had entered seemingly hours before. And there, immediately beneath me, was the chair, with its nail-clawed armrests. Somehow, I'd been transported back to the regular world. I'd won against the nightmare. But still, something felt odd. I felt strange in a way that wasn't quite physical, but subtler than that. A vague tension seemed to smolder beneath my scalp, as if there existed a new, previously absent layer between my brain and skull. It wasn't alarming, so much as unfamiliar, but even as I noticed it, I grew more accustomed to it. And before long, I was almost comforted by it, as if it acted as a protective, insulating layer against... I could not and still cannot say what. It's a strange thing, but, oh well. What harm could there be? And that was, there's an empty house in my neighborhood with a chair facing a wall. For a cheeseburger, I went inside and sat there. By Weird Bryce Guy. Now, I love Weird Bryce Guy's stories. I mean, we've read quite a couple on the channel, and they're always really good. They've always got like some really interesting elements to it, a lot of things that really kind of make you think a little bit outside the box sometimes. He also has a fantastic vocabulary. I think that really makes it a little bit more fun, especially for me reading, because I read a lot of these stories, and as you can imagine, not all of them are amazing, Well, most of them are pretty good, I'll be honest. The majority of them are pretty good. But no, it always gives me a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of a really got to focus on the kind of what's going on while I'm recording it and everything. It's really good. I like the fact that you've got this doll maker situation going on, which clearly is abandoned. Something's happened to the doll maker. Nobody really knows. Maybe murdered by dolls. Great that everybody comes up with their own like urban legends and everything based on what's happened. And then you end up finding out that the character, they go into the abandoned house. They find the crazy scrawlings on the wall. They read them out. Clearly some kind of an incantation, maybe some kind of a summoning, maybe, who knows? That's the thing. It does something. Whether you read it correctly or not, the fact is it does something. Which then makes you think, okay, so maybe the doll maker was into some crazy stuff. Or maybe they stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to. And no matter what, they've got this kind of separate space out of like, it's almost like a pocket dimension or something like that, not entirely sure. That it seems like that's where they were able to do some of their work as well. Which is quite strange when you really think about it. But then it makes you wonder, well, was this of their own choosing, or were they kind of taken over by a demonic force that made them do it, perhaps? Some kind of entity, not really sure. It does make you think, and I think it's the beauty of this. It makes you think, did he knowingly do all this? And then also, what happened? I mean, obviously he's dead. Like, there's no denying that. It's not like you encounter the doll maker in this place. It's just whatever made the doll maker make these dolls, or maybe he found the dolls, we don't know. We don't know, but that's, yet again, it's the beauty. It makes you wonder, it makes you think, but you've still got enough information to go with to kind of give you an idea of like, okay, well, it could be this, it could be that. No matter what, it's horrific. I've always hated dolls, especially little creepy dolls. It's just something uncanny and creepy and weird about them. Plus, they tend to get possessed an awful lot. There's tons of videos online about dolls getting possessed and moving on their own and stuff like that. There's even, I think one of my favorites is there's like this store. I don't know exactly what country it's in. Maybe South America somewhere. Could be like Mexico. I'm not entirely sure. But basically it's this store and they have like a bunch of, novelty things for kids and stuff like that. And something always ends up moving or tripping an alarm or, it's really weird. But the family's not, like, distraught by it. If anything, they're more annoyed. They're like, come on, stop fucking around with our stuff. It's great. I think it's really funny. I haven't seen any of the videos recently, so I'll have to go see if there's any new updates on that. That'd be quite cool. Anyway, I've really enjoyed this, and I sure hope you have too. This has been Nate at Night, and we'll see you for whatever's next. Take care. The Crossbow Killer of Lake Attabat. The summer before heading off to college, my friend Camden and I were celebrating our last summer together. We'd grown up together as neighbors, but we were heading off to different colleges. Our plans were about as simple as they can get. There was a blank space in our calendars, a decent sum on our bank accounts, and a gassed-up car. That's it. That first week was insane. Camden had to balance constant calls from his mom with being an absolute beast. He'd be doing cranberry vodka shots 1 second and calmly describe his breakfast in perfect detail the next. We spent 2 days with his distant relatives in Rochester. He may or may not have made out with his own cousin during a particularly high-stakes truth or dare. I can neither confirm nor deny. A couple of days before heading home, we decided to have a final camping night. We split up for a day to see our families and get some supplies. Then we met up at Lake Attabat. Lake Attabat is a bit of a local secret. We got to know about it from Camden's cousins, who more or less dared us to go there. I mean, they expressly told us not to go there, but we took it as a challenge. It was supposed to be an old fishing lake surrounded by small cabins for rent, but the owners had neglected them for decades. All that was left were these crumbling log cabins and an absolutely stunning beach. I was looking forward to getting some alone time with Camden. We'd been so busy living the high life that we hadn't gotten any time to just chill, to talk about the future and make plans. Maybe we'd go fishing. But when I rolled up to Lake Attabat, Camden was already there, and he wasn't alone. He brought 4 friends to keep the party going. The only one I knew by name was Harris. He'd been an acquaintance hanging at the edge of our social circle for a while. A weird guy who asked a lot of questions. But I also knew that the only reason Camden would invite him would be to get a shot at his older sister. We'd never been formally introduced, but her name was Tammy. She didn't look the part of your average law student. She looked much more at home in a mosh pit in a sweaty basement. Tammy had, in turn, brought 2 of her sorority friends. The 3 of them were in the process of claiming the least rotten cabin off the beach as Camden and Harris collected firewood. Camden waved me over, calling out everyone to come meet me. My heart sank a little. It was going to be fun, but I would have liked to just spend some time with my friend, too. This was quickly turning into something different. I was surrounded by smiles as I was introduced to Tammy, Pam, and Carrie. Harris gave me an uncertain wave from the sidelines. Camden wrapped an arm around my neck. "This is my brother right here," he called out. "I'm the pretty one, he's the good one." And just like that, the stage was set. We ended up making a fire by the beach, grilling a few hot dogs and having a couple of beers. Harris wasn't feeling it and ended up spending most of his time fixing the old floating dock instead. I noticed Carrie was giving me a little extra attention. She was a peculiar woman with a long face and almost cartoonishly large eyes, but her confidence and genuine personality was difficult not to like. I ended up talking to her for well over an hour. Harris came back with his hands on his hips, clearing his throat to get attention. "I need something to tie the tanks with," he said. "The what?" Camden asked. "What are you talking about?" "The barrels, the things that make the dock float." Harris sighed. "We need something to tie them on." "Just ditch it," Camden frowned. "Come on, sit down, have a snack." "Didn't we say we were going to fix this thing?" Harris snapped back. "Or was that just something you said to keep me busy?" It got awfully quiet. I looked around and pointed to one of the old cabins. "I think I saw a garden hose out back," I said. "You can use that. Won't rot." Harris gave his sister, and Camden, a long look. He shook his head, thanking me under his breath. To Harris's credit, he managed to fix the floating dock. It was big enough for all 6 of us, as long as we stood up. If someone was going to sunbathe on it, we might fit 3, if we crowded a bit. The thing was surprisingly solid. Harris definitely knew a couple of sailor's knots to keep the supports in place. Harris and his sister were polar opposites. While Harris kept to himself, Tammy was taking bikini selfies next to the no diving sign. Pam was talking to her parents on her phone, while Carrie and I were sitting beachside, dipping our feet in the warm water. The sun was setting in about an hour or so, covering the lake in a golden glow. It was going to be a great night, I could tell. We all went out on the floating dock. Tammy and Camden sitting side by side at the edge, kicking us out into the lake. We were cheering, teasing, laughing, all the things you're supposed to do when you're young and curious. We went out on the middle of the lake. Everyone but Harris dove in head first, ignoring the abandoned no diving sign. The lake was colder than expected, and I wasn't the only one to shiver a little. That didn't stop us, though. Within seconds, I saw a bikini top being tossed around like a ball, and there were smiles every which way I turned. Well, except for Harris. He turned to us, saying something. I'm not sure what. He was pointing, trying to get our attention, but that wasn't happening anytime soon. I had Carrie right next to my ear, asking me to keep her warm. Camden and Tammy were just full-on making out against the floating dock. I casually looked the way Harris pointed. I could see something in the distance. There was someone on the beach. I didn't know what to make of it. Even at a distance, I could tell they were tall, somewhere around 6'8". Possibly a man. He was wearing some kind of World War II-era rubber gas mask, but without a filter. He had this massive grey trench coat that looked too big even on him. It left a long trail in the sand. There were countless pockets sewn on the outside. He had a crossbow. Not one of those black, sleek, modern ones, but something he'd put together in a garage somewhere. The thing was massive, probably made from the leaf spring of an old car. It was solid metal. The second we looked his way, he hooked the crossbow to something on his belt and stepped into the sand. Despite such a massive frame, I could tell he was struggling. There was a loud click. He pulled something out of his coat. An arm's length of sharpened rebar. It just took a couple of seconds, all in all, and the sight was too strange to react to appropriately. Harris looked back at the rest of us as the conversation died down. We were still smiling, but it wasn't a conscious reaction. It felt like rabbits freezing at the sight of a predator, hoping it wouldn't see us. But of course it did. We were completely exposed in the open water. Harris turned to his sister, casually pointing towards the beach. "You know that guy?" Tammy clung to Camden's shoulder, looking towards the beach. I saw her eyes go wide as the man on the beach raised the crossbow. He didn't need time to aim. We were sitting ducks. There was a click, a thunk, and a whip-like snap. It was less than a second. A bolt of sharpened rebar, as long as my arm, burrowed deep into Harris's chest. There was no scream or cry, just a puff of air as his lungs emptied. I still hear that sound sometimes. A single forceful cough, like he swallowed something the wrong way. The force was so intense that it looked like turning off a switch. Harris smacked down to the floating dock with complete abandon, splaying his arms out like a crucifixion. Immediate panic erupted. Camden held Tammy back from climbing up on the floating dock. Carrie and Pam hid under it. I didn't understand what was happening and lingered a little too long, watching our attacker hook the crossbow on his belt and step down, preparing for a second shot. Hadn't it been for Camden calling my name, I wouldn't have snapped out of it. I dove, swam over to the others, and hid under the floating dock. There was already blood dripping between the planks. Tammy couldn't stop screaming, her eyes so wide they looked black. The shouting was so loud and constant that it just blended into a mix, making it sound like nothing at all. This was just what the world was like now. Panicked open mouths, screaming at everyone for answers. There was an awful crackling sound as 4 planks were torn apart by a second shot. The force rippled through the air, and I could feel it even at a distance. We all hid under the dock, keeping our heads down and trying to show as little of ourselves as possible. But seconds later, I heard him firing again. Another couple planks exploded into tattered fibers, the whole funneling Harris's blood right down on us, mixing the smell of wet wood with sickening volumes of blood. Everyone was talking and screaming over one another. Carrie was screaming at us to dive, while Pam was telling us to split up. We didn't do either. Instead, I watched through the gaps in the dock how the man reloaded again and got down on his knees. He was planning something. He was shooting at an angle, trying to get the bolt to skip across the surface. It worked. There was this approaching noise, heading straight for us. I could see the ripples on the lake where the bolt had touched down. It was dark under the dock, but I could hear the shot slamming into the back of Pam's cranium. The water got warm as life left her. Tammy tried to get away, but Camden was holding her back. If she swam out from under the dock, she'd be an easy target. Instead, we hid behind the supports, these large white air tanks made of hardened plastic with little blue sunflower logos on the side. Another shot rippled across the water. It smashed through the dock, effectively ripping it in half as the last plank shattered. Some of the supports came loose, but me and Carrie clung to them like life vests. "They're not hard enough," Camden screamed, holding Tammy close. "We gotta do something." "What?" Carrie screamed back. "What the fuck are we supposed to do?" Another shot. This one crashed into the side of the support I was holding onto, ripping it out of my arms. It snapped my shoulder so bad that I got a bruise. It was such a massive force, like a battering ram. I was fine, but left exposed. I got a clear view of him hooking the crossbow to his belt again and stepping down on the crossbow, already preparing another bolt from his jacket. I waved at Camden, showing I was okay, then I dove. The support I'd been hiding behind was intact, but it drifted off about 10 feet. I could make it. Diving down, the water was surprisingly clear. I could almost see all the way to the bottom. There was more debris than I anticipated, things blown out from the beach and claimed by the lake. A ruined rowboat, an old tarp, the remains of a parasol. The screaming was just a faint murmur. I saw their feet kicking wildly. Looking over at Carrie, her feet had stopped kicking, and the water was turning red. The screams got louder, but not from her. I came up behind the white air tank I'd been clinging to. Tammy wasn't even making sense at this point. It was just an animalistic screeching. Camden looked like a fish out of water, his mouth wide open. The floating dock was broken in two, but the pieces were still held up by the remaining supports. It was a little easier to hide behind, but it was just a matter of time before this whole thing would sink. I dove down again. At first it was to get away from a potential shot, but I had an idea. I swam down and grabbed the tarp, and the old parasol. It was just a couple of aluminum poles at this point. Coming back up, I held the tarp over myself like a makeshift tent, using one of the poles at an angle. I figured it might obscure me just enough for him to miss a shot or two. It smelled like old dirt and algae, but I was too panicked to care. "He's gonna run out of bolts!" Camden yelled. "We gotta bait them out!" There was something to it. The bolts were large, and even with a large jacket, there couldn't be that many left. Tammy watched him closely, and as soon as he finished reloading, she called out, "No!" Then we all dove, trying to move around. I ducked my head under the surface as I heard the approaching th-th-th-th. Another bolt gone. Disappeared into the lake. I came back up, hiding under that tarp. I tried to take long breaths, but it was difficult. Not knowing when the next bolt would fire meant it could come just as I exhaled. As Tammy called out another, "No!" I dove down like a bullet. I looked back at the others. No more blood in the water. All feet were still kicking. We managed to bait another couple bolts. Then it was a long pause. No one was calling out anything. I looked out from under the tarp. Camden and Tammy were looking out from the side of the wrecked dock. The man in the gas mask was just standing there at the shore, looking at us. He seemed to have one more bolt at the ready, but was reluctant to fire. Maybe he wanted to align that perfect shot. "He's waiting for us to get out," Camden said. "He can't keep guessing. He needs a clear shot." Tammy just stared at him. She couldn't look away. Camden was talking to her, but his words just passed right through. "He can't stay here forever," Camden continued. "We wait, and then we split up." Tammy nodded, keeping her eyes on him still. We must have stayed in the water for well over an hour, clinging to the remains of the dock. The sun was setting, quickly making the water inhospitable. We were shivering, and our lips turned blue. There was a very real chance we'd get hypothermia. My hands were cramped into claws from holding onto the air tank too hard. I could barely feel my feet. He wasn't leaving. He was standing in that exact same spot, waiting to load his crossbow. The bolt dangled from his hand. Camden's jaw was chattering. He was worse off than me and Tammy. I was getting worried he might lose consciousness if we didn't act soon. It was getting darker, so it would be harder to hit us. It was now or never. We had to try. We decided to go on the count of 3. Tammy counted us down. 3, 2, 1. We all got out of cover, Tammy called out, "Now!" and I dove. The final bolt sailed right past us. We were in the clear. I popped my head up to see the others heading straight for the shore. The man was just standing there, trying to figure out his next move. We were halfway to the shore when I saw him put his hand down his other jacket pocket. He pulled out another bolt. It was a trick. He'd faked running out. Camden called on us to scatter. Tammy told us to keep going for the shore. I begged them to get to cover. Our voices intermingled into a yelling mess as I saw him step down on the crossbow and load another bolt. He took aim at us. "Now!" Tammy called out. "Fucking now!" We all dove, but we were out of breath. A couple of seconds passed, and as I broke through the surface, I heard that familiar thumping. Except now it connected to something with a sickening crunch. I hid behind one of the air tanks, and I could see someone else do the same in the distance. I couldn't see who it was. The lake got eerily quiet, leaving only the echo of birdsong. I was colder than I thought. I hadn't noticed my teeth chattering. I clung to the side of the air tank, letting my legs rest. I had to break the silence. "Captain!" I called out. "Yeah," he responded. His voice was weak, his throat raw. It barely sounded like him anymore. I could almost hear his breathing, even from a distance. "Tammy!" he called out. "Tammy, are you—" There was no response. Only birdsong. Another click as a bolt was loaded. I could barely see the man on the shore, but the silhouette was clear. The crossbow was raised and ready. He was listening. Aiming. He might have had more bolts than we'd anticipated, but he was making them count. I slowly paddled back towards the tarp I dragged up, wrapping it over the air tank. In the dark and from a distance, it sort of looked like a person. "I'm heading to shore!" Camden called out. "See you there!" "Hold on!" I called back. "Wait a minute!" "I can't, man!" he sighed. "I can't! I gotta! Hold on!" I repeated. "Don't fuck this up!" There was no response. I just heard the pitter-patter of someone paddling back to shore. I got out of cover, beelining towards Camden. Another thunk as a bolt released. It smacked into the air tank I'd covered up with the tarp, punching a hole straight through. Camden called out my name, but I didn't respond. I figured if the attacker had thought he'd gotten me, maybe he would stop firing. Then again, maybe he'd go for Camden instead. I had to keep a low profile. Something brushed against my leg. I was in the middle of the debris from the floating dock. There was a piece of garden hose that Harris had used for repairs. I carefully brought it up, blowing out the water inside. I could use it as a makeshift snorkel. I swam towards the shore at an angle, as slowly as I could. As I got closer, I dove down. Fumbling with my stiff hands, I found a large rock. I held it close as an anchor to weigh me down. I held the hose up over the surface. I could breathe through it, but it was a bitter taste, leaving a layer of bacteria on my tongue. The waves would sometimes go a little higher than anticipated, forcing a gulp of water going down my gullet. It was probably the longest couple of minutes of my life. I was shivering with every step, clinging to a slippery stone at the bottom of the lake. Shallow breaths interrupted by little drops tickling my throat. But I had to keep going. The water was getting too cold. Soon enough, my head was just below the surface. I had to be really close to the shore. I got down on my knees, crawling the last few feet. As my head breached the surface, I saw that I was off to the side, away from the beach. There were rocks covering the ground, cutting the soles of my feet as I struggled to stay quiet. The evening air was chilling. I made my way through the underbrush, stepping on roots and fallen branches along the way. I couldn't feel my fingers, and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. I stepped over a fallen chain-link fence, noticing a half-rusted old metal sign. A few letters had faded, but the message was clear. Private property. Violators will be shot. There was even a little smiley in the corner. I saw the beach from the tree line. Camden had made it ashore, but he was barely holding on. He was laying in the sand, doing his best just to breathe. The man with the gas mask was approaching him with a loaded crossbow. But he wasn't shooting. Not yet. If he wanted Camden dead, he'd be dead already. Instead, he just approached. He poked at Camden with the tip of his boot. But nothing happened. No reaction. I think Camden had lost consciousness by then. Maybe losing everyone was too much for him to bear. No matter the cause, Camden had completely given up. The crossbow man seemingly decided against wasting a bolt on him. Instead, he calmly raised the no diving sign that Tammy had posed with earlier, unloaded his crossbow, and wandered off like nothing had happened. As soon as the coast was clear, I ran like a man possessed. By the time I made it to Camden, he was barely breathing. I looked around the beach, couldn't see my things in the dark. I tapped Camden on the cheek, trying to get him to focus, but his eyes were rolled back. There was a noise. It came from Camden's clothes, just a little further down by the water. His phone. It was his worried parents, calling for the third time today. It was easy to forget how often Camden talked to them. I must have sounded absolutely unhinged when I answered, begging them to call for help. Not long after that, I had the emergency services on the line. I had to perform CPR to keep Camden breathing. By the time the EMTs got there, he'd lost a lot of color. We were both severely hypothermic. Those few final minutes at Lake Attabat was nothing short of psychedelic. Colored lights from 4 different vehicles mixing in the dark, highlighting angry and stressed faces. The occasional flash of a camera photographing a body washed up on the beach. A paramedic trying to get me to focus on a little light that he held in front of my eyes. I heard him talk, but it was too distant, like he wasn't really there. For a moment, I thought I might have hallucinated this whole thing. Maybe I was still out in the lake. Maybe this was me watching my life pass before my eyes. I could hear that thumping noise as the metal bolt skipped across the surface in my mind. I could hear it so loudly and clearly that it might as well have been real. A problem that persists to this day. And as we left Lake Attabat, I could imagine the glare of 2 slides of glass from a gas mask in the distance. Watching. Waiting. The police came to talk to me at the hospital. They were asking about us trespassing and what had happened. They didn't seem to believe me when I told them about the Crossbow man. Autopsies revealed that Pam, Carrie, Harris, and Tammy all had alcohol in their bodies, which was enough to blame it all on some kind of accident. The police had a smashing floating dock, plenty of alcohol, and 4 dead bodies. They connected their own lines. Puncture wounds and witness statements be damned. There were no charges, no investigation, no outcry. Harris and Tammy's parents lost 2 children that day. Camden and I have since tried talking to them, but there has just been no reasoning with them. I don't blame them. They're completely broken. Camden and I have been back there a couple of times, putting up signs of our own, warning passers-by of a murderer. I was back there last year, and someone had taken the sign down. The no diving sign was as visible as ever, though. That last summer at Lake Attabat was the worst thing I've ever experienced. Just seeing a body of water can make my teeth chatter nowadays. It's like my blood remembers before my mind does. I'm thankful that I can still talk to Camden about it. I think he's taken it worse than me. He's much quieter nowadays, and he rarely goes outside. We're the only ones who really know, and the only ones who truly believe. We've tried to tell others, but they think we're making this up. It sounds much better to have a crossbow-wielding lunatic than people drowning from alcohol poisoning and a failing floating dock. And people believe what they want. There are accidents all the time. People go missing all the time. But sometimes the answer is right there, and no one is asking the questions. And to kick off Halloween, we're ending with The Crossbow Killer of Lake Attabat by Saturdead. I quite enjoyed this story. The title alone immediately jumped out to me, and I was like, oh, is it going to be kind of like a Jason type situation where there's kids at a place they're not well, I mean, Cape Crystal Lake is a different thing, but the fact is there's kids, there's a lake, there's a killer. It speaks for itself. Typical teenage slasher kind of stuff, which is great. I was like, oh, that's a great way to enjoy Halloween. Sounds like great fun. And sure enough, I was pretty dang on the money. Really fun, really simple story of kids, well, teenagers, whatever. People getting together, having a good time at a lake. Things go awry. There's a killer. But then the only problem about it, the only real thing I have against it is just the fact that, the police clearly didn't give a shit. They didn't give 2 shits to investigate, which doesn't seem believable. I mean, if it was one kid, fair enough. They might be like, oh, okay, foul play happened. but multiple, you know, especially with the wounds they had. I mean, they got shot by rebar. The rebar's still going to be in them, which, by the way, doesn't normally go in people. Of course, they're going to be like, yeah, this don't look right. I mean, rebar is a building material, whatever. Oh, it might be found in the dock and stuff. No, it's going to be found at like regular construction sites, not for a floating dock. That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, besides the incompetent police, which happens a lot in these kind of stories, but that's, I suppose, part of it. I don't really know. You really have to boil down the questions about this killer, right? Let's go ahead and dive a little bit more into him, because he's like 7 foot tall, with a large trench coat, which, by the way, is still longer than him. So this is a custom-made thing he had to get. And then obviously his custom-made crossbow firing rebar. It's a horrific thing. It makes me think of things like Dead by Daylight. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane. Or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, it's like this shouldn't be happening. You know, holy shit, this guy is really meant. He's coming to kill people. He's for sure coming to kill people. It was so good. I really enjoyed the story, and I thought it was just so fitting for Halloween. I really do. And God, I sure hope that you guys have enjoyed it too. I really don't have anything bad to say about it, besides the police thing. That was probably the only thing. And the kids, I suppose they're a little dumb, but at the same time, if they're in a really panicked situation, it's not just that they're being attacked in the middle of a lake, but they might also die because of drowning, hypothermia, exhaustion. They could die of other reasons as well, so it's not just they could be shot. There are other reasons. I totally get why they panicked. I totally get it. You're in a multi-bad situation, you know what I mean? A number of things could go wrong, and you could die for whatever reason. It's just horrific. Just a horrific situation to be in. Clearly that guy loves that lake. I'm guessing he lives there. Most likely the situation. And, he doesn't like people fucking around in it. That's why he was really adamant with the signs. Just being honest, that's my opinion. We sadly don't have any more information to go off of, but yet again, it makes me think of like a typical teenage slasher situation. The killer, could, for all we know, be sort of I'm trying to think of the word. Almost maybe supernatural. That's not quite the word I'm looking for. It's more like a superhuman type situation. You know what I mean? Like the human is not 100% normal anymore. I mean, like I said, Jason is probably the best example from the Jason franchise, the never-ending Jason franchise, Halloween. Well, even Mike Myers is a good call. Yeah, Mike Myers. He's still kind of human. He's still mostly human, but I guess he's also kind of supernatural strength-wise, similar to Jason in a way. But Jason just never dies. That's his thing. Whereas Mike Myers, I feel like Mike Myers could die. I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of the Halloween movies in a while. I feel like we got to re-up that. There's supposed to be a new one coming out as well. I'll have to look into that. That'd be cool. Anyway, this has been a wonderful time. I have really enjoyed myself, and I sure hope you have too. There's going to be less stories upcoming because I'm trying to kind of shift into other things because I feel like I need to. It's not that I'm never going to do stories again. Don't get me wrong. Of course, I'll cover certain stories, especially if there's ones that people want me to cover and I'm allowed to, and blah, blah, blah. And obviously Twitter will carry on as it kind of does if and or when. Obviously keep my eyes on that. But I feel like I'm going to just kind of pivot into some other stuff because I can. And I feel like I need to. I need to try to keep innovating, keep trying stuff, and, hopefully keep evolving the channel in a way that I can actually do this full time and I can actually have this be my career. Because if it doesn't, then I have to kind of take a step back from this and go back into regular working, and that's not a problem. It just means there'd be less of me for all of you, That's the way it is. Anyway, not to put a damper on the situation. Happy Halloween, everybody, and we will see you for whatever's next. Take care out there. Thank you so much to my YouTube members and Patreon members for all the love and support. It's thanks to people like you that we can keep growing.